Chapter 1. The Missing Part. Azil impatiently stood at the workbench testing her latest invention. As she propped another Durval and frantically retried the action barometer, she let out another angry no. Not again, she thought, tossing the wrench onto her cluttered workbench. The small gadget was missing something, but she didn't know what. She had been working at this all morning with little success. It was unusual for a project this straightforward to provide such a challenge. While working on previous inventions, Azil had always craved the challenge of testing and finding solutions, but on this particular morning she felt completely disconnected from what she was trying to accomplish. For several days now she had been working diligently on the action barometer. Azil had seen its rapid evolution from a rough initial sketch to the fascinating object in front of her. The entire process had been an exciting new challenge that filled her with enthusiasm. Initially, Azil felt this latest gift for her best friend was one of her finest ideas yet, but now she was beginning to have doubts. What is wrong with me? This should be easy, she thought. On any normal day, she would be done and on to another project by now. But this was no ordinary day. She desperately needed something, anything that would get this invention working properly. She fervently glanced around the tiny workshop looking for a solution she hadn't thought of yet. If she was going to find any useful parts or tools, they would have to be somewhere inside the workshop, because her mother would never tolerate such things in the rest of the house. First, Azil checked all the shelves next to the workbench that held the larger metal parts, but quickly realized that was pointless. Why would I need a part that's bigger than the entire action barometer? She thought. She knew the solution, whatever it was, would most likely come from a small part or a subtle adjustment to what she had already done. Maybe there's something in here, thought Azil, dumping a large steel bin of tiny parts onto the already disorganized workbench. After thoroughly rummaging through the pile and finding nothing to spark her imagination, she sighed and dropped her head onto the workbench, catapulting small metal pieces all over the workshop. For the first time in her life, Azil felt like what she had imagined most of the other Fids in the village felt like all the time. She was completely uninspired and unmotivated to do anything that required the slightest amount of thought or effort. The possibility of being anything like the others scared her. Within the Fid community, Azil was a complete outsider. The high level of passion and dedication she put into her inventions was not only rare, it was practically non-existent within her society. Many of the others had no specific hobbies or interests of their own and simply couldn't understand why anyone would choose to dedicate their time and energy like she did. As much as she would have liked it to, the effort she put into her work did not go unnoticed. Throughout her life, she had been teased and ridiculed for her abnormal behavior and, despite this, had grown to accept herself for who she was. Deep down, Azil knew she was exactly who she wanted to be and was living her life exactly the way she wanted to live. But the way she was feeling at that moment had nothing to do with her own eccentricities, nor the opinions of others. It had everything to do with the fact that, for the first day in Azil's life, her father would not be there. The weight of knowing that she would never have him around to share ideas, laughs, and other magical experiences was too real for her to absorb in that moment. Even in the comfort of the workshop amongst the thunks, Merlot, Kinnocks, and other metal parts, Azil felt lost. Normally she would be lost in the joy of discovery and the creation of new and marvelous things, but on that morning she just felt numb. Azil's feeling of disconnection caused her attention to drift away from her project. With her head resting on the workbench, she gazed off into the corner of her workshop where something instantly caught her attention. It looks like I'm not the only one who's working in here, she thought. It was a spindle with black and yellow patterns on its body, and it appeared to be keenly focused on what it was doing. Azil jealously observed as it busily weaved its web. Normally, envy was not an emotion she was familiar with, but she could see this spinder knew what needed to be done, and was doing it with ease. In swift sweeping motions, it constructed the threads of its web in what appeared to be an effortless dance. The spindle had no concerns about being right or having the right parts. It was thoroughly absorbed in its task. It surely wasn't caught up in the overwhelming fact that its one and only father had suddenly vanished, or what was more commonly referred to as being norphoonicated into the great glow. What exactly does that mean anyway? She thought. Azil never really cared for some of the vague ideas like norphoonication that permeated her society. The way she had always understood her world was through clear and solid evidence based on her own observations. She simply could not accept the rationale that, on the previous night, her father was somehow absorbed into the luminous green sky that hovered above their world. Azil was suddenly jarred out of her mental haze by the familiar clonking of metal feet on the soft dirt floor. She quickly grabbed the action barometer, shielded it from view, and turned her head toward the door behind her. Azil was greeted by the shimmering silver face of her best and only friend Voda known, who stood in the entrance to the workshop. "What is that?" Voda asked. "What is what?" asked Azil, smiling. "That thing you're trying to hide from me." Azil realized it was pointless to try to hide the gift she was making for Voda and let her see it. "This is the actin barometer I was going to surprise you with when I was done, but you ruined it." "Oh, you made me an acton thermometer? That was so sweet of you. I've always wanted an actin barometer," said Azil, rolling her eyes. "Well, I like it." "How can you like it? You don't even know what it does. So what does it do?" "You'll find out after it's done. But that may be a while." Azil carefully put the actin barometer down on the workbench and turned back to see Voda, smiling widely. "Okay, what is it? I can always tell when you want something. Think about it. What day is today?" Voda asked. "Oh, that," said Azil, remembering the annual festival. "Please tell me I'm not going through this without my best friend." "I already told you I didn't want to go. Come on, you got to be there. All the Fids in the village are supposed to be there, including us. More than anyone, you should know how much I don't feel like celebrating," said Azil, lowering her head and turning away. "Don't think of it as celebration. Think of it as a social restructuring. Speaking of restructuring, wait till you see my brother." Azil quickly lifted her head and turned to face Voda. "What happened to Boden? Don't you remember?" "That's right," Azil said, "his transformation. So your older brother finally grew up." "Yes, and it's weird. You've got to see him. I can't believe he's no longer a midi like us." "You know, I'd love to go celebrate with everyone," said Azil, rolling her eyes, "but I have a lot to do here. I want to keep working on your present, and there's still some things I need to figure out. Come on, Az, you need to get out around other Fids. It's not good for you to be alone at a time like this." "Your dad, my mom, they're not coming back. I'd rather stay here. I don't feel lonely when I'm busy in the workshop. It's like he's still here with me. I really feel alone when I'm out there with a bunch of Fids I don't understand and who don't understand me. They will never understand you if you stay hidden in here all the time." Voda motioned to the small cluttered workshop and smiled. "You may be a freak, but this village needs you and your brilliance." Azil crossed her arms. "Well, they're not getting any of my brilliance. I'm saving that for the ones who appreciate it, and since my father's gone, you're the only one left. Seriously, Azzy, our world's over. It's boring without you. That's because nobody really does much of anything, at least anything meaningful. They're all too worried about what others will think. Everyone's the same, all shine and no substance. Maybe they just need an example, someone who's bold enough to do what she loves. You know, someone creative and intelligent." Voda nudged her on the arm and smiled. Azil was beginning to feel awkward and wanted to shift the conversation to any topic other than herself. "What about you? You're the boldest Fid I've ever met. And your brother, he's Boden. Well, he's not the guy you think he is." "What is that supposed to mean?" Azil leaned against her workbench and accidentally knocked some of the tiny parts onto the floor. "What kind of guy do you think I think he is?" Voda crouched down to pick up the parts, then handed them to Azil. "None of that matters because he's nothing like he was when you saw him last. He's changed a lot. And it's weird." Azil casually tossed the parts back onto her workbench. "What do you mean weird?" "It's hard to explain. Just wait, you'll see." Voda's eyes suddenly widened. "Oh, but I haven't mentioned the best part. Boden, my goofy older brother, he not only became a big today, he's becoming a daddy." "That's right, I almost forgot. That's why you have to go to the festival with me. You're going to want to see this for yourself." "All right, I'll go." Voda grabbed Azil by her solid, metallic wrist. "Great. Let's go." Azil pulled back. "Hey, can I catch up with you? I've got to finish up here." "Just don't take too long. You don't want to miss anything." "Relax, I'll be there." "Oh, I know," said Voda, winking at Azil as she walked out the door. Azil grinned and turned back toward the workbench, trying to remember what she had been doing. Her mood sank as she was instantly jolted back to the reality of that morning and her struggle with the actin barometer. Rarely did she need help, but this was one of those times. For the slightest moment, she thought about asking her father, but quickly remembered as the weight and numbness returned. Azil still had her mother and loved her dearly, but no one could compare with her dad. As a caring father who spent most of his free time working on projects with Azil, he truly understood and accepted her the way she was. She learned everything she knew from him, from how to properly dosify a Nurkadine to finding the best spots in the swamp for locating potagons and other rare parts. Her father demonstrated to her an alternative approach to life, another way of being that was rare in Zovia. Where others would recoil from the things they didn't understand, he would investigate. From a young age, Azil found his curiosity to be refreshing and quickly discovered this quality within herself. Their shared curiosity had sparked the development of numerous inventions and had led them on some of the most exciting expeditions of Azil's life. Some of her best memories with him occurred on what they would call discovery days. On those days, they would leave early in the morning and set out for one of two places, the edge of either the wetlands or the swamp forest. On the edge of the swamp forest, among the gaps between the roots of halobial swamp growths, they would usually find large metal items like rods, panels, or glanks. These were plentiful and useful for some of their larger projects. But Azil preferred the discoveries they'd make along the edge of the wetlands. There, among the claw-like hollows created by the aerial roots of the smaller angrove trees, they were more likely to find what her father liked to call the good stuff, smaller, unique metal parts that had never been seen or touched before. The intriguing forms of these one-of-a-kind discoveries would inspire new ideas in Azil and her father. In fact, some of their best inventions had come from experimenting with these parts. Parts? Azil wondered. This was one of those words she had used every day of her life without much thought. The word part implied it had come from something that was whole, but she had always used parts to make something whole. For the first time in her life, this didn't make sense to her. What were these parts a part of? She thought, rubbing her chin. One thing was clear to her: there had always been an abundance of them. They were scattered everywhere throughout the village and the rest of the swamp. Lost in thought, Azil's attention drifted back to the busy spinder as it continued to spin its web. She always wondered how tiny creatures like insects could be so intelligent and efficient. This spinder, for instance, somehow knew the perfect location to construct its web out of her way in the corner of the workshop. Azil watched in amazement as it generated its own delicate building material, adding to its complex geometric pattern. How is this tiny creature able to make it look so easy? She thought as her attention moved back to her project. And why am I making this so difficult? She knew the answers were not coming anytime soon and realized she needed to step away for a while. Azil took one last look at the unconventional, shaking her head in disgust. She then turned back to the spinder. "I got any ideas, little one? Why don't you see what you can do while I'm gone?" She quickly reorganized the workshop, picking up stray metal parts and returning tools to their proper places. She imagined the process as a way of erasing the forgettable and unproductive morning. As she repositioned the vorometer on the workbench, a thought popped into her head: a possible solution. A sprunket. I wonder if that will do it. Azil grabbed the unconventional and held it up in front of her. She carefully rotated it in her hands as she pondered this new possibility. Yes, that could work, she thought with a smile. Suddenly, for the first moment without her father, Azil felt that magical spark of insight she'd grown familiar with during all those times she was able to easily access solutions. She could almost hear her father's excited voice. "You're sparking now, Azil." She walked toward the entrance of the workshop and turned back for another look at the room where she had brought so many inventions to life over the years. "I'm sparking now," she said quietly to herself as she turned and walked out of the tiny workshop. In many ways, the workshop was the only room that mattered to Azil. Since her mother never went in there, it was the only place where Azil felt truly free to express her individuality. Unlike the workshop, the main room of her family's home was nothing special, just a small open space with dirt floors and bare metal walls. Her mum liked the simplicity, but Azil thought the emptiness was dreary and boring. Azil found her mother standing alone in the main room, silently looking out the window. "Are you okay, Mum?" Her mother instantly appeared to snap out of a daze. "Of course, never been better," she said with a smile. "You sure?" "It's just that, Azil. Don't you start worrying about me, especially on a day like today." "You mean the worst day of my life?" "Don't be silly." Her mother laughed uncomfortably. "Speaking of the festival, shouldn't you be getting ready?" "I'm as ready as I can possibly be." "You sure?" asked her mother, stepping closer to examine her face. Azil took a step back. "What? My face?" "It wouldn't hurt to give it a little buffing, especially around the eyes." Her mother darted out of the room for a moment, then reappeared with a handful of soft brown pobs. "Mom, come on, I don't need." Azil tried unsuccessfully to dodge her mother's large metal hands. With one hand, she grabbed Azil by the back of the head and then rubbed the soft pobs firmly against her face with the other. Azil knew from past experience that it was useless to struggle and just waited patiently for the buffing to end. "All done," said her mother, stepping back to examine her effort. She tilted her head and smiled at her daughter. "Now, was that so bad?" Azil crossed her arms. "Yes." "Oh, don't be a glunker-dunk. You want to look good for the festival, don't you?" "Does it really matter?" "It's not like I feel like celebrating anyway." "Oh, well, nobody needs to know that. If you insist on being a downer, at least join in the celebration and look like you're having fun." "How? Celebrating the sudden and permanent disappearance of someone I care about is not my idea of fun." So why should I pretend that it is? My father's gone and I'm not going to smile and act like everything is perfect when it's not. I know it has been tough, but it's all part of the cycle. It has always been like that, and it will always be like that. We're only here for 36 years, and that is never going to change. It just doesn't make any sense, said Azil, shrugging her shoulders. He was here yesterday, and now he's nowhere. You know where he is, Azil? You know what happens when our cycle ends? We hear the story every year at the noob introduction. Your father is now part of the Great Glow along with every other Fid that has come before. Everyone in their society knew the Great Glow as the hazy greenish sky that's hovered above their world since the beginning of time. The story had been passed down through the generations for as long as anyone could remember. The Great Glow was understood to be the source of all life. It provided each Fid with enough energy to live out their 36-year cycle, but no more. After that, it would require its energy back, and that individual would be gone. None of it makes any sense, Azil said. How do shiny metal Fids just disappear into a green haze? It's all part of the norphoonication process. That's all you need to know, said her mother, shrugging. But Azil knew enough about how her world worked through observation and experimentation to realize that norphoonication, as well as many other accepted truths within her society, made no logical sense. To her, what was even worse was her society's reluctance to ever question anything about their world. She was never quite sure why that was, but assumed it had something to do with everyone's desire for acceptance, the one thing she had given up on a long time ago. Mom, I need to get going. Azil turned toward the front door and opened it to leave, but stopped as her mother began to speak. Okay, if you see your younger brother, keep an eye on him. I don't like him hanging around those two troublemakers. All right, Mom, said Azil casually, while secretly hoping not to run into her younger brother or any of his annoying friends. And Ace smiled. No one likes a downer. Azil quickly flashed her mum an exaggerated smile before continuing out the door on her way to the big event. Chapter 2. The Fids. Zovia was alive with excitement. Despite another rainy day in the swamp, nearly all 76 members of the Fid community had gathered in the center of the village for the annual festival of the Great Glow. It was the single most important event of the year, when everyone celebrated and welcomed the newest members into their society. As Azil grudgingly walked through the village on her way to the gathering, something peculiar caught her eye, perhaps a sign of hope on what had been the most difficult day of her life. Normally, she would have been indifferent to the sight of a crowd of Fids off in the distance, but there seemed to be something magical, almost surreal, about the way they shimmered beneath the glowing sky. A luminous amalgam of vivid greenish hues reflected off their shiny wet metal bodies as they slowly milled around. Maybe this won't be so bad after all, she thought, standing there in a state of wonder. Moments later, her fascination subsided, and she reluctantly continued across the village to search for her one true friend among the crowd. Eventually, Azil made her way to the crowd of Fids who had been forming around the small stage in the center of the village. This area was commonly known as Fun Central. Azil never understood what was so fun about it. There was really nothing about the entire village that resembled fun, as she understood the word. To her, the concept of fun was exemplified by the crazy machines, gadgets, and other inventions she and her father had made over the years. Other than the Holobile Groks, the only things in the village that were remotely interesting to her were their houses. Azil could tell there was an intelligent logic to the way they were designed to fit snugly in between the massive Grok roots which meandered around the village. The 19 houses formed clusters around the base of the trees and appeared to be constructed from the same metal panels and scrap she had seen scattered throughout the rest of the swamp. Azil and her father had shared many conversations about the houses. They always held a certain mystique for them. Her father told her the village was built so long ago that nobody even knew who was responsible. Looking around, it was clear to Azil that the houses they lived in were extremely old. Despite their immaculate shine due to excessive buffing, they were gradually falling apart. Many of them had become dilapidated and were now missing sections of their walls and ceilings. She had always wondered what the village looked like back when it was first constructed. Additionally, she liked to imagine what it might look like one day when it was fixed up or rebuilt completely. Azil, along with her father, had worked on some difficult projects in previous years, but the thought of building an entire village seemed completely overwhelming. Still, the idea illuminated her imagination and brought a smile to her face. While everyone else in the village was focused on the stage, Azil found her mind wandering, wishing she was in some other place some other time. It's like I'm living in the wrong time, she thought as she began to imagine what it would have been like to be one of the original designers or builders of their village. Where did all those creative and ambitious fids go? She wondered as she slowly drifted back to the insanity that was the current state of the village and its citizens. Although the official activities had not yet begun, the crowd was buzzing with intense chatter and giddiness. This sight was not unusual, as the dominant attitude of Zovia was known as unconventional, characterized by an exaggerated display of amusement and hyper-superficial engagement with life. This kind of overly joyous display laced with insincerity had always annoyed Azil, but on this particular day it was especially difficult for her to witness. She could only imagine the absurdity of some of the conversations taking place as she watched small clusters of fids grinning at one another with their freshly buffed faces. After witnessing this spectacle, Azil began to reconsider being at the festival. Just as she started to pull away, someone in the crowd called out to her, "Az over here," yelled Voda, waving frantically. Azil reluctantly squeezed through the crowd and joined her. "You're lucky you caught me when you did, because I was about ready to split." "Seriously? It hasn't even started yet." Voda inspected Azil's face curiously. "Ooh, nice, you even buffed?" Embarrassed, Azil quickly put her hands in front of her face. "Let me guess your mum mugged you before you could escape. Hey, can we change the subject?" "Well, I'm glad you're here," said Voda, looking toward the stage. "And just in time. It looks like they're about ready to start." Azil never shared the same positive attitude toward the festival or any other village activity as Voda. She quickly scanned the audience and shook her head. "Don't you get bored with all this?" Azil asked. "It's the same thing year after year. I'm kind of curious to see who's going to be my new niece or nephew." "Oh yeah," replied Azil, her attitude slightly improving. "I almost forgot." But she knew waiting for that moment meant having to stand around all afternoon watching what she thought of as the endless parade of blah activities. In actuality, the remainder of the afternoon would include only 3 short events: Moodlena, meeting of the noobs, noob orientation, and the Great Noob spin-off, which paired each noob with a pair at one of the noob eggs. As Azil stood there in the crowd, she hoped her quiet demeanor could mask her true feelings. On the inside, she felt like a caged animal, and she really hoped nobody would notice. She stood there, trying to remain still and silent as she stared in the direction of the stage. Apparently this act wasn't fooling anyone, especially Voda. "Relax," she said with a warm smile. "You look like you're about to explode. Is it that obvious?" asked Azil, grinning. "I know you're not enjoying this, but I'm really glad you decided to stick around." Azil tried to loosen up and looked around at the jubilant crowd that had gathered. Unlike her, they had all spent days preparing for this event. She knew their faces and bodies had been buffed and rebuffed. Normally a preoccupation for many of them, buffing became an obsession before any public event. This necessity for the entire body to shimmer with an intense metallic luster was not shared by Azil. To her, it was merely a physical manifestation of the unconventional attitude. Just the thought of it irritated her even more. Look at all these fids all chipper and glossed up celebrating the day away, while each of us has a parent who is gone forever. I am not enjoying this one bit. Hey, look. Voda pointed to the stage where 3 individuals were seated next to one another on an old grok log. To the left and center there were 2 women, and on the right was a man. "Is that your brother?" "It sure is. Look at Bowden. I still can't believe he's a big." "Weird," said Azil, gazing at his shiny metallic form in wonder. "I told you. It's going to take some time to get used to your new brother." Bowden was clearly taller than before, and his shoulders were also much broader. Just the previous day, he had looked like all the other MIDI boys and now appeared to be a completely different fid. Although the strangeness of his new form would take some getting used to, the sudden change was nothing particularly unusual. This wasn't the first time Azil had come to the annual event and witnessed that overnight transformation where girls and boys she had known emerge at the festival as women and men. Although this time it was different. It was her best friend's brother, whom she had known and secretly admired since they were noobs. "That will be us in a year, Azil grown up." Azil rolled her eyes. "Great, just when I was starting to get used to being a MIDI." Suddenly, everyone's attention turned to the stage as the announcer stepped forward and began to speak. "Gladys Snatus Wikisu, welcome Zelkom Vu." Everyone enthusiastically cheered at the short and energetic fid as he continued. "It is now my pleasure to welcome you all to this sigmatic and magnopious event. Now, let's show a little Arfug Sniggity Narkle for our favorite guy, the genius of Olus. The sparkle in our Arfug Narkle, the king of Zing and glorious master of Zovia Asda the ultimate." At that moment, The crowd burst into a loud chant of verp, verp, verp. Azil did not participate in this demonstration, but watched the crowd as it continued for what seemed to her an eternity. Eventually, a face poked out from behind a metal wall toward the back of the stage. As this happened, the chanting intensified, but suddenly ceased as the face disappeared behind the wall. Then the face returned, along with the louder verp, 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 only to disappear once again. This continued several more times as Azil looked on stupefied, hoping the insanity would soon be over. She could not believe that this ridiculous man was not only their great leader, but her very best friend's father. She had known him for years and had seen two very distinct sides to him, the outrageous showman that everyone else knew and the more serious and protective father to Voda and Boden. Since she had grown up around their family, there were things Azil knew about their great leader that few others were aware of. For instance, she knew his real name was Lazov, but he wanted everyone to call him Azdor because he thought it sounded more grandiose and leaderly. Azil had learned some strange things about him over the years, although most of it didn't make any sense to her. One thing was certain: the connection Voda had with Lazov was just as strong as the bond she had shared with her own father. Despite her best friend's affection for her father, Azil was suspicious of him. Deep down, she felt there was more to this man than anyone knew, even his only daughter. Somehow she could sense that behind his charismatic charm, he was hiding something. Of course, this was something she could never discuss with Voda, and decided it was best to keep this and other observations to herself. Finally, Lazov emerged onto the stage as the crowd burst into a thunderous roar. Like the other Fids, his freshly polished body gleamed in the green glow of the village. But unlike the others, Lazov was not completely bare. His body was decorated with chains made of a strange yellowish metal that was unfamiliar to Azil. Although Lazov always wore jewelry, it was extremely rare to see anyone else wearing it. Ironically, it was Azil who was most familiar with jewelry. On several occasions, she had made metal bracelets and necklaces simply for the sheer joy of making something new. The crowd continued to express their excitement for Lazov as he slowly meandered his way across the stage. After a few graceful spins and several deep bows, he began to speak. "My fine Fids, what a glorious reception. I am humbled to be the leader of such a boisterous bunch. Now, please let us start the first of our three big events." The crowd quieted as Lazov waved his hands around with dramatic flair, then continued to announce the name of the first event. The mood went up. The level of the crowd slowly increased with a continuous ooh-ooh-ooh. This was cut short by Lazov, who continued with a subtle, yet growing attitude of impatience. "Before we get to the moo, our first event, I would like to introduce everyone to our three newest bigs." Lazov smacked his hands together and pointed to the three Fids sitting on the log. "From left to right, we have Darbasan, Ambul Pramp, and my freshly upgraded son, Boden Thobe." As the three Fids waved, the crowd erupted in cheers. Lazov immediately put his hands up, silencing everyone and enthusiastically continuing with his spiel. "As you all know, being a big comes with new fun abilities. These three lucky Fids will soon be brand new mommies and daddies." "But to whom, you ask?" Once again, the crowd started chanting. This time they repeated, "Whom? Whom?" But instead of hushing the crowd, Lazov joined in the rowdy chanting of whom, followed by a loud "Whom, you ask?" At that moment, he twirled around and pointed to the metal wall at the back of the stage. Facing the crowd, Lazov looked over his shoulder and noticed that nothing was happening. Again, even more intensely than the first time, he pointed behind him. "Whom, you ask?" he shouted with an awkward smile. But still nothing happened. The crowd fell silent with an awkward anticipation. In a whisper loud enough for everyone to hear, Lazov said, "The noobs, you fool. Release the noobs." Finally, a little girl slowly wandered out onto the stage and was immediately greeted by a roar from the crowd. Instantly, she began to shuffle backward in fear. As she started to disappear behind the stage, two other noobs bumped into her, forcing her forward. Azil realized they must have been pushed onto the stage by someone. Now all three noobs stood, huddled together in the center of the stage. "Whom, you ask?" Lazov spun around and dramatically pointed to the noobs. "These guys." The crowd erupted in what was a mixture of giddy laughter and intense excitement. Some of them jumped around, clapping violently and out of sync, while others laughed and spun around where they stood. Azil did not participate in the commotion. Her eyes were fixed on the noobs. She could see that they were quite uncomfortable. One of the girls seemed to be examining her arms and shuffling her feet, while the other girl cowered behind her, hiding from the chaos. Next to them stood a little round boy who blankly stared out into the rambunctious crowd. Azil noticed that he was vibrating in terror, As someone who remembered the trauma of being a noob tossed into a world where you know absolutely nothing, she understood their discomfort and confusion. What she didn't understand was the complete lack of empathy demonstrated by the other Fids. Am I the only one who notices their confusion and fear? She thought. Azil's agitation escalated as the scene in front of her dragged on. The crowd's overdramatic and disingenuous reaction was nothing new to her. As someone who had experienced years of ridicule for being different, she knew that these noobs couldn't possibly be enjoying their first few moments as members of the society. Azil felt their pain as she witnessed what she felt to be a complete lack of compassion from the crowd. She couldn't understand why everyone was so unaware that their actions were frightening the noobs. Are they that ignorant, or do they really not care? She wondered. Finally, Lazov raised his arms and instantly the clamor ceased. He then gestured to the three noobs. At this moment, I would like everyone to meet the first of the three newest members of our suffus magnificus and utterly feditious society, Pinsy Rim. The three noobs looked at one another with confusion as they squirmed around. Lazov pointed at the group while slowly moving his finger around. You, no, not you. On the left, girl on the left. No, my left. Yes, you, here. He pointed to Pinsy, then to his side, come here. Pinsy cautiously waddled over to Lazov and stood next to him. He completely ignored the girl as she quietly stared up at him and continued to introduce the others. And number 2, Gersa Ferp. With that, the crowd began a new chant. This time a deep and intense ferp, 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 echoed throughout the village. Pinsy, frightened by the noise, began to cower behind Lazov. He quickly grabbed her arm and pulled her back to his side as he tried to get Gersa to come up front. Gersa. Come on, darling. Lazov slowly walked over to the frightened girl and took her hand. Azil noticed he seemed to demonstrate a greater level of kindness toward her. Come on, don't be frightened. Gersa clumsily walked with him, stumbling as if she was still in the process of learning how her legs worked. Once Lazov had calmly guided Gersa across the stage, he quickly regained his dramatic demeanor and began to introduce the third noob. And our final member, said Lazov, turning to the nervous boy, is a pudgy little guy. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you for the first time ever Noobly Punched. Somehow the crowd was able to outdo the intensity of their previous demonstration, this time with the ongoing chant of punched, punched, punched. It may have been the intensity of the crowd or simply Noobly's own clumsiness, but something had caused that little round metal boy to fall to one side and literally roll right off the front of the stage. With that, the crowd lost it. Everyone was pointing and laughing uncontrollably, even Lazov. The Fids in the front moved aside and stared down at the small noob rolling around in the dirt. Every time he tried to stand up, he fell back down again. Azil watched as Voda let out a few giggles, but she didn't see the humor. She didn't understand why nobody in the front was helping him. That poor little noob, she thought. This is how we welcome him into our society, by teasing and laughing at him. Noobly squirmed and struggled on the ground as the crowd continued to laugh. Eventually it appeared as if the boy had just given up. Realizing he was motionless, the crowd gradually grew silent. Azil's anger and confusion had now turned to worry. Did they tease him too much? She wondered. Looking down at the small boy, Lazov shook his head. Oh no, this is horrible. Now you've done it. He looked up and scanned the crowd accusingly. Are you all proud of yourselves? Your laughter has apparently forced this poor little guy into a permanent state of paralysis. Suddenly, a gasp swept through the crowd. They were all horrified, including Azil. She could not believe what she was hearing. Is it true? Can someone really be permanently paralyzed by fear? She thought. Lazov's face looked grim as he looked down at the boy in the dirt. He slowly began to shake his head. Poor Nubs. Poor Nubs. He didn't even last a day in this cruel and dangerous world. As Lazov continued to speak, Azil felt there was something disturbing about not really what he was saying, but how he was saying it. It was as if he was mocking everyone, making fun of their concerns for Noobly. Before Lazov could say another word, the boy on the ground twitched and continued his struggle to stand. Instantly, the crowd erupted, cheering that Noobly was okay. Azil was simultaneously relieved the boy was safe, but bothered by Lazov's apparent manipulation of the crowd. He must have known Noobly was okay the whole time, Azil thought. Why did he feel the need to scare everyone? This time Noobly was helped back to his feet by several members of the crowd. They all worked together to lift him back to the edge of the stage. Lazov leaned down and grabbed the boy's hand, pulling him up. Nubs, you sure know how to make an entrance. You had us worried, Lazov said, chuckling. He turned back to the crowd and continued the event. Now that we have introduced these three little ones, I'd like to get them acquainted with our world here in the swamp. As most of you know, the Great Glow has only given us 36 years each. After 36 years, our energy is returned during what is called the norphoonicated process, and then our time is up. Over the course of our life cycle, we are given 3 phases. During the first phase, we are only noobs like these 3. Lozov motioned to the noob standing next to him, then continued. Throughout the second phase, we have slightly larger bodies and are called middies. And when we reach the final phase, we are transformed into the biggest and strongest type of fid. It is when we have reached this phase that we join the ranks of the adult members of our society known as the bigs. That is also when we become parents to one of the noobs sent down from the Great Glow each year at this magical time. Azil couldn't help but notice Lozov was speaking in a manner that was uncommon for him in public. He was usually more boisterous and goofy, but this seemed different, as if he had been regurgitating this information from memory sentence by sentence. She also thought the information he was sharing was much clearer and more concise than his usual ramblings, as if it was something he truly wanted everyone to understand. Azil had remembered this speech from previous years, but she had never really paid that much attention to it. This year was different. Something deep inside Azil, perhaps a growing suspicion, urged her to take notice. As Lozov continued to speak, she listened carefully to every word. Our society is currently 76 fids strong. We haven't lost anyone in a long time, and I prefer to keep it that way. So first, I'd like to teach you 3 about safety. Number 1, you must respect the Great Glow. Not only does it give us life, it gives us sight, and it can take both away in an instant. Let me tell you a little story. Azil watched him closely and noticed something she had never noticed before. He wasn't looking directly at the crowd, but down at his hand. What is he doing? She wondered as Lozov shared his story. The Great Glow once thrived. There was only the glow, never blindness. But over time, the Great Glow has lost nearly half of its energy. This loss of energy has happened because foolish individuals have caused interruptions to the norphoonicated process by allowing themselves to be destroyed prematurely. Not only have these fids disappeared forever, but their unsafe actions have led to more blindness in our world. Long ago, our society was twice this size, and during those times, the Great Glow was constant. It never required periods of rest like the ones we are experiencing these days. In the past, the days were eternal. Over time, as we've continued to lose members of our society, the nights have grown longer and longer, making our world more dangerous than ever. Suddenly and surprisingly, one of the noobs tapped on Lozov's leg to get his attention. Where did all the fids go? Asked Jazar, staring up at him. A startled murmur came over the crowd. Even Azil was surprised. She knew that the public asking of questions was in direct conflict with the spirit of Arfid Narkal. Perhaps even more surprising to her was Lozov's kind and gentle response. My dear Jersa, many horrifying things have happened to fids who have wandered off into the blindness. Deep within the swamp, there are many dangers. Most of us have heard the horrific screams of the vicious Groken, which lies high up in the swamp Groks. It hunts the swamp at night during times of blindness, devouring everything in its path. That is why we must be vigilant and stay safe during these times. We must stay inside all night, and whatever you do, never, ever go up into the trees. Azil had not only heard this warning echoed throughout their society, she, along with every other fid, had heard the beast itself. All throughout her life, she had cringed at the various shrieks, howls, and screams, which emanated from the swamp forest beyond the village. Azil noticed a sudden shift in Lozov's attitude, as if he had become aware that he was slowly drifting into downer territory. He quickly changed the subject and continued with a more positive vibe. All right, let's keep this party moving. That noob orientation was starting to drag on. Now, who's ready for the Great Noob spin-off? I know I am. As the crowd cheered, 2 bigs emerged from the back of the stage carrying a huge wheel. Like almost everything else in the village, the wheel was constructed entirely of metal. Azil looked at it closely and saw that there were 3 crudely drawn noobs evenly distributed around its face. The 2 bigs carefully placed the wheel next to the 3 new parents-to-be, then turned and walked to the back of the stage. Azil had seen this wheel many times before. It had been the key decision-maker in their society for as long as she could remember. The wheel was divided into multiple equal sections and was used to choose between any number of possibilities. It stood upright, and along its perimeter there were dozens of tiny metal pegs. On this day, the wheel would be used to determine the fate of the 3 noobs, as well as the new adults. In the past, Azil had not shown much of an interest in the spin-off, but this year she was curious to see which of the 3 noobs would be raised by Voda's brother. Since the moment she first saw Noobly, Azil secretly hoped he would be paired up with Boden. The thought of him taking care of Nubly and teaching the little guy about the ways of their world was quite amusing to her. She giggled as she imagined the possibility. With the wheel in place, Lozov gestured to his son. Boden, since you're the tallest, I think you should spin the wheel first. He approached the wheel and gave it a surprisingly weak spin for his size and strength. This alarmed Azil. What is he doing? He's not even trying to spin that thing, she thought. The wheel barely made a complete rotation. As it slowed, the clicker looked like it was going to land on Jersa, but at the last moment it jumped one more notch, landing on Nubly. Azil was delighted as she watched Nubly's enthusiastic reaction. He darted across the stage and attached himself to Boden's leg. Daddy. Nubly shouted excitedly as he stared up at Boden. Azil watched in confusion as Boden began to shake his leg, trying to dislodge the boy. Why is Boden being like that? Azil wondered as she continued to watch him shake his leg. No matter how hard he tried, Nubly didn't move. But nothing prepared Azil for what happened next. Lozov ran to his son while shouting, "Do over, do over? I hadn't given the signal yet." That was an unqualified spin. Sorry, punts, my boy, but this guy's going to have to spin this thing again. Lozov abruptly began pulling on Nubly, trying discreetly to disconnect the boy from his son. Come on, Nubs, let go. He needs to re-spin. Azil was shocked and confused by what she was seeing. It was clear to her that this was a fair spin. It was also clear to her that Lozov did not want Nubly as a member of his family. She felt this was so unfair. Who does Lozov think he is? She thought. Why is he sabotaging what could be a wonderful relationship between Nubly and Boden? She couldn't imagine a life without her father, and now Nubly was about to lose his father before even getting a chance. Suddenly, she found herself shouting out loud at Lozov. Not fair, those two need each other. Don't take away Nubly's daddy. Lozov froze. He stopped pulling on Nubly and focused on the source of the distraction. Wait, what is this? There appears to be a downer trying to pollute the joy of this delightful event, said Lozov, looking directly at Azil. The crowd disappointingly turned to Azil as she proceeded to voice her disgust. Don't you all see? He is messing everything up for those two. Doesn't anyone care? Doesn't anyone care about anything? Well, I care. I care that Nubly should have a dad. Every kid needs a father. Azil pointed to Lozov. And don't you have any compassion for anyone? Everyone gasped, including Voda. Azil saw her friend staring at her, wide-eyed, but she was determined to let her opinions be heard and continued in a louder, more determined manner. Your son and daughter just lost their mother. Your wife is gone forever, and you act like it makes no difference. Lozov put his hands over his ears and shouted back at her angrily. Enough. This is not acceptable behavior. We have all gathered here to enjoy this wonderful event, and you are ruining it with this display. Of all fids, you should know better. There is a proper way to express yourself in this village, and that is the unconventional way. I am sorry, young lady, but you are officially banned from group activities until you have learned to express yourself in the appropriate manner. You are to leave now and spend the rest of the afternoon with the rest of the junk at the heap. Lozov forcefully pointed toward the edge of the village as he continued to speak. Now go. He casually turned away from her and continued in a smug tone. Now where was I? Ah, yes, we've got a grandiferous event to get back to. Just as excitement hesitantly began to grow among the crowd, Voda called out. Wait, Dad, she's just playing. She wasn't trying to be a downer to Azil. Everyone turned their heads to Azil. From her expression, it was quite clear she was not playing. As she prepared to reconfirm her position on the absurdity of the event, Voda interrupted playing with her father as the crowd listened attentively. Come on, Dad, look at her, she's sorry. Lozov turned to Azil and narrowed his eyes. Is this true? Are you willing to finally embrace the unconventional attitude and join us for the remainder of this spectacular unconventional event? Azil had no interest in witnessing any more of Lozov's performance and responded seriously. Can you repeat the first option? The crowd had grown impatient with her and slowly began a new chant that was meant to demonstrate their displeasure, but instead it sparked something within Azil. To the heap, to the heap, to the heap, they shouted continuously. It was at that moment Azil realized this was at her way out of there. Then not only was she getting an opportunity to leave, but she was going to the heap, the perfect place to find a sprumket for her latest invention. As the chanting continued, Azil bowed to everyone and gracefully exited the crowd. Without looking back, she smiled to herself and began the short journey across the village to the heap. Chapter 3. Blark-a-lark. The heap, a towering pile of scrap metal, had always been one of Azil's favorite places in the swamp. In many ways, she viewed it as her own private domain away from home, a place where she felt truly comfortable just being herself. She loved everything about it and had been there hundreds of times by choice, but never as a punishment. Located just outside the village on the edge of the dense swamp forest, this extensive pile contained a wonderful variety of metal scraps in nearly every shape, size, and color. From the smallest bit to the largest chunk, nearly anything Azil could ever want to make, whatever she dreamed, could be found here. Scattered throughout the heap were large grey rectangular panels, rusted orange tubes, swirls of green strips, and much more. As a noob, she would climb through the pile to help her father find specific metal components for their many projects. Like Azil, the heap had grown a lot since then and was now more than twice its original size. It was no mystery to her what had caused this. Throughout her life, she had seen an ever-increasing level of intolerance toward black or confusing things. She didn't understand how the same scraps of metal, which fascinated her, seemed to confuse and even threaten the others. Several years before, Lazov had instructed the Fids that all scraps and any other black discovered in the village and surrounding areas needed to be removed on site. Since that declaration, the variety and magnitude of magnetal parts lying around the village had decreased, contributing to the rapid growth of the heap. What is it about this stuff that everyone finds so threatening? She wondered as she eagerly began to maneuver her way up the massive pile. All around her were unique remnants from a time long forgotten. To her, the heap was a mound of fascination filled with an incredible array of textures, colors, and forms. Whether she was alone or with her father, some of Azil's most vivid memories were created there. On many occasions, she would go to the heap alone just to wander around, thinking about life and her creative ideas. Often she had used the heap simply as her sanctuary, a place to go and get away from the other members of her society. She knew that many Fids viewed the place as a perplexing mess, while others found it to be completely unbearable. The few who could actually tolerate the heap could probably be tolerated by Azil. Most of the others couldn't understand the joy Azil and her father got from discovering unique parts and finding new ways to use them in their creations. The desire and enthusiasm she felt for creating was a rarity in her society. Other Fids found their obsessions in tasks that were simple and repetitive, like buffing. Buffing was something that they could understand, something they knew they couldn't mess up. They did a simple action and got a clear result, and it produced the benefit of causing their metal bodies to shine under the great glow, which most believed to be of extreme importance, but not Azil. She knew she only had 36 years and wanted to use them wisely. I have far too many discoveries to make and things to create to waste my cycle buffing, she thought, purposefully inspecting some of the metal parts around her feet. Azil, are you out here? Hearing her mother's voice, Azil popped her head up. Are you okay? Her mother asked, standing at the bottom of the heap. Mom, I'm fine. What are you doing here? I have some wonderful news. You don't have to stay here any longer. I talked to Asdor, and he wanted me to let you know that your punishment is over. Azil laughed. Mom, it's really not that bad. You do know this is my favorite place in the swamp, right? Yes, and I was hoping you'd grown out of it by now, her mother said, sighing. I'll never understand what you see in this place. It's better than having to stand in the village and witness Asdor's ridiculous behavior. Azil's mother gasped. I didn't raise you to be disrespectful, especially to our honorable leader. Honorable? Did you see how he treated Nubli and that wheel that was completely unfair? Azil, you know Asdor makes the rules. I know. He makes up a lot of things. Most of what he says makes no sense. Like what? Oh, I don't know, Azil rubbed her head. What about how he's never clear about where noobs come from? You're still young, Az, give it time. I didn't understand any of it when I was your age. So now you do? You understand how no matter what year there are always the same amount of fresh noobs as the number of new parents, even though the number of new parents always changes? Her mother's eyes widened. Well, what does the Great Glow count the number of new parents and only send at many noobs? What's going on up there? Azil asked, looking up at the luminous green sky. Does the Great Glow have a stockpile of noobs waiting to be sent down? Or what? I'm not exactly sure, her mother said, shrugging. Doesn't make much sense, does it? I know you think it's weird how vague Asdor is about all this stuff. Azil's mother smiled. What's weird is you worrying about everything. And that makes me worry about you. Mom, we've had this conversation before. You don't have to worry about me. Great. Does that mean you're coming home with me? Can't I stay a little longer? I just need to find one little sprunket, then I'll come home. Okay, but I don't want you staying here too long. The blindness will be here sooner than you think. I know, it shouldn't take me much longer. All right, but please come home before I start idling for the night. Okay. Bye, Mom. Her mother began to walk away and quickly turned back. Oh, Azil, if you see your brother, can you send him home? After her mother left, Azil climbed all the way up to the very top of the heap to continue her search for a sprumkit. As she began shuffling parts around, she continued to wonder about all the strange thoughts that had been clouding her mind. Am I the only one in this whole village who thinks these things are weird? No one dared to openly question the way their society functioned. It was practically taboo to even show the slightest level of inquisitiveness. Has it always been like this? I wonder if any other Fids even think about these things in private like I do. She doubted if anyone ever gave much thought to anything. They wanted things to be simple and easy. Most of them found contentment in the monotonous and predictable task of buffing metal, whether it was their possessions, bodies, or houses. And it's not just the buffing, thought Azil, tossing an unusable chunk of metal back onto the heap. Most of them simply cannot deal with anything remotely involved or challenging. She knew there must have been others in their society's history who enjoyed the rewards of finding solutions through experimentation, discovery, and the creation of new things. Their thoughtfully designed homes were proof of that passionate dedication to a desire to make a better, more interesting world. Both Azil and her father were driven by that excitement. Sadly, that force which had motivated Fids in the past had somehow disappeared over time and been replaced by a cautious hesitance masked by a phony expression of joy. Now they simply avoided anything that wasn't perfectly simple and straightforward. It's as if her society had all trained themselves over many generations to make everything simpler and simpler to the point where mere curiosity had become a chore. Azil wasn't sure how or why this shift in her society had occurred, but she knew Lazov's constant encouragement of the orthogonal attitude wasn't helping the situation. It was as if he was encouraging everyone to stay enveloped within a blissful state of their own ignorance. Azil's search for the sprumkit hadn't uncovered anything useful. As she continued to pick up parts, inspect them, and toss them aside, the peak of the heap was beginning to look more like an indentation. With every useless piece she cast aside, she anticipated finding a sprumkit or perhaps something even more rare and exciting buried underneath. At this point, she'd be happy with any discovery. I can't believe this is taking so long, thought Azil, lifting and tossing metal parts aside expeditiously. She knew that sprumkits were plentiful within the swamp, and she'd used dozens of them for previous inventions. As she continued to dig and shift debris around, Azil wondered, as she had often done before, where all the metal had come from. Her father once told her that it had been around since he was a new, but nobody knew its origin. Did it all come from the Great Glow at some point? She wondered. She knew that metal was unlike the plants and trees, which dropped debris in the form of logs, leaves, and other wooden fragments around the swamp. Again, Azil caught herself questioning things she really had no way of answering, so she refocused her attention on the search. All of Azil's effort shuffling parts around and digging deeper had caused her to nearly disappear within the mound of metal. With her head sticking out of the top of the heap, she noticed a short, feisty middy boy. Instantly, he spotted her. It was Bebas, one of her brother's rowdy friends. Azil knew this meant Morval must be nearby as well. Hey everyone, look! The junk pile grew ahead, shouted Bebas, pointing up at Azil. She just ignored him and kept searching. Bebas continued his taunting. Hey Curve, it's your snag sister. Azil noticed her brother hiding behind a tree and called out to him. What's wrong, Morval? Afraid I'm going to tell Mom you've been hanging out with Bebas Blat. Morval casually stepped away from the tree while Bebas responded. Let me guess, you're looking for a Snoveldine Kagamkin for your next invention, the Fusnogel Debuminator. A third boy, Nolan Lork, appeared next to Bebas and continued the taunting. Yeah, or the Grogle's nerve that turns noobs into snoobs. What's a snoob? Azil asked inquisitively, knowing all along there was no such thing. How should I know I'm not an inventor like you? That's too much work, and work is for Dirk and Nurks, said Bebas, jumping back into the conversation. But I thought you were a Dirk, a Nurk. Azil responded. Bebas glanced at his friends, looking slightly embarrassed, then continued with his explanation. You know what I mean? Making stuff is for Fids like you who just don't know how to have real fun. Azil noticed a flaw in Bebas' argument. Well, you guys must not know how to have fun either, because you just made up a whole bunch of crazy words which sounded a lot more like work than fun. Morval looked at his friend, waiting for a snappy comeback, but all Bebas could produce was a blank stare. I don't know about you guys, but watching her dig through that pile of junk isn't much fun at all, Morval said. Hearing Morval's voice appeared to revive Bebas, who motioned to the others. Come on, guys, let's get away from all this blah-blah. After the boys left, Azil questioned their flawed understanding of the concept of fun one, which seemed to be the norm among the entire community. What is it with these fids? Inventing things is fun. Building things is fun. She paused for a moment and inspected two unusual parts. Holding them together, she imagined some of their possible configurations. She quickly realized she needed to keep moving and enthusiastically continued her search. And digging through this pile of junk is fun. Azil could only imagine what some of the other fids must think of her. Her life was dedicated to an enjoyment that came from doing the kinds of things most of them avoided at all costs. It made no sense to her. Why is everyone so afraid of doing anything that offers the slightest challenge? She realized that everyone's fear of anything that required effort, whether it was through doing or thinking, was causing them to miss out on some of life's most valuable experiences. Combing through the endless mound of parts, she continued to wonder about the other fids. Do they not know how it feels to have a purpose? To learn new things? To create? To have dreams and goals? Azil's search, which excited her in the beginning, had now become tedious and uninteresting. She just wanted to find a sprumkit and go home. The longer she rummaged through the metal scraps, the more they were all starting to look the same. Now, bored with her task, Azil sat down in the small hole she had dug out. Suddenly, Azil heard the clanging sound of feet climbing on the heap. Someone's here, she thought, looking up toward the top of the hole. In that moment, the last thing she wanted to do was to talk to another fid. Maybe if I stay quiet, they'll go away. From where she sat, she was unable to see who was there. As the sound of metal on metal grew louder, Azil realized her unwelcome visitor was coming closer. She became more annoyed with every step she heard until a face appeared above her. What are you doing here? They both said simultaneously. Azil was shocked to see Bowden looking down at her. His wide eyes appeared to mirror her own surprise. Azil? What are you doing up here? Or should I say down there? You don't remember? Your father kicked me out of the festival and sent me here. Bowden grinned. Yeah, but he never said you had to bury yourself in a hole. I'm not burying myself. I'm just sitting here. I just don't understand. Why are you even here still? I mean, I thought my father ended your punishment. Being sent here is no punishment, not to me. Believe it or not, I actually like it here. Bowden sat with his feet hanging over the edge of the hole. Because it reminds you of your father? He asked softly. Azil nodded, then lowered her head. I understand. I miss my mom too. It's just not fair, said Azil, her voice shaky. He leaned down and put a hand on her shoulder. Hey, are you okay? Not really, she said, looking up at him. But who is? I mean, do you think anyone in Zovia is ever happy? Sure. Well, I guess. No, I mean truly happy, and I'm not talking about that Arfuxmarkle nonsense. Bowden laughed and nodded his head. It's so fake, right? They only act happy because they think they're supposed to, or something. Looking up at him, Azil tilted her head to one side. When you make things in your workshop, it makes you feel great, right? His eyes grew wide. Yes, I thought I was the only one. Why do you think I'm in my workshop all the time? Azil asked, shrugging. I guess I thought it was because everyone annoyed you. Azil grinned. Is it that obvious? A little. Hey, you never told me what you're doing here. He casually looked away and shrugged. You know, just looking for a couple parts for something I'm working on. Me too. Well, one part, to be exact. Bowden got up and smiled at her. Well, good luck with your search, thanks. He turned and walked away, quickly disappearing down the side of the heap. Azil stood up and noticed he was heading back toward the village. Okay, that was strange. She couldn't believe how abruptly he ended their conversation. And what about the parts he came for? He just left here empty-handed? Azil shrugged and went back to her quest to find what she came for. Bowden's short visit had left her with mixed emotions. There was something bizarre about the way he went away so quickly, while at the same time, their brief conversation left her with a sense of hope. All this time, she thought only her and her father enjoyed the challenge of making things. Now, even though her father was no longer around, Azil didn't feel so completely alone in her desire to create. Even her best friend couldn't relate to the kind of excitement Azil felt as a result of her creative endeavors. Although Voda was genuinely more passionate than most fids, especially when it came to exploring the swamp, she never really enjoyed the idea of making things. Azil had noticed how any creative work made Voda feel uncomfortable, like she was afraid she'd screw something up. Aside from that, Azil still felt as though Voda was one of the only truly kind and genuine fids she had ever known. How is it that we are able to defy the odds and express a true joy for life while everyone else seems to be faking it? She wondered. Azil had become lost in thought and nearly forgot what she was doing, again having to refocus her attention on the search for a sprumkit. After all the time she had spent searching, she could not believe she still hadn't found what she was looking for. Where are all the sprumkits? She wondered. The enthusiasm she had previously felt was now bordering on agitation. Azil knew she would be needing to get home soon and didn't want to leave the heap empty-handed. Feeling a sense of urgency, Azil decided to speed things up. Instead of wasting time investigating each and every part, she began to quickly grab and toss them aside. Now she was progressing several times faster, sending parts flying in all directions. Unique parts that would normally cause her to pause and imagine their possible uses were immediately rejected. As her speed increased, so did her frustration. Just as she was about to give up, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. It was a sprumkit. And no ordinary sprumkit. It was what her father liked to refer to as an ardent sprumkit. What made this one special was its awesome and familiar kind of metal. Azil picked it up, smiling as she examined its smooth, silvery white composition. Its unique qualities reminded her of the metal that formed her body and the bodies of all the other Fids. Like their bodies, Ardum could be buffed to a mirror like shine. As she inspected the sprumkit, she realized it was unlike any she had ever seen. This sprumkit was in pristine condition. Its original state was well preserved and unaltered by the pressure generated by the weight of the heap. It's perfect, she thought, and it would allow her to finish the unconventional she was making for Voda. She couldn't wait to see her best friend's reaction when she finally got to try out her new gift. With the sprumkit clutched tightly in one hand and the blindness creeping in, Azil realized she had to get moving. But first she needed a safe place to store her discovery. She opened the small round door in the front of her abdomen and gently placed the sprumkit inside. Although many of the Fids saw the bibbit as a pointless area of the body, Azil found it to be extremely useful for the temporary storage of small items. Normally Fids would point and laugh at others who fiddled with their bubbit in public, but this didn't concern Azil. And ironically, she found that keeping these small pieces of black hidden away in her bibbit helped her to avoid an even greater amount of ridicule. She knew from previous experience that anyone seen carrying metal parts into the village would immediately be scolded and publicly humiliated by onlookers. Over time, she had discovered that the reaction Fids had to those who were seen carrying such black had a lot to do with the direction they were walking. Azil laughed as she recalled the reminder her mother always shared with her and her brother. Black in, nobody wins. Black out, nobody shouts. During her prolonged and intense search, Azil had become unaware of the fact that she had gradually become trapped in the heap. All of her digging within the same area had generated a crater in which she now stood. Because of the hole she had created, Azil could no longer see down to the bottom of the heap. And no one could see her. Finally, she found what she had searched for, but now she was stuck. Are you kidding me? Azil thought. The coming blindness would soon make it impossible for her to see, and she knew she desperately needed to get out of there. Her natural problem-solving skills instantly came up with a possible solution. She stood on her toes, reached as high as she could, and began knocking parts down into the hole. Once enough metal had fallen, she pushed it up against one side of the pit and formed a ramp. As she slowly worked her way up the ramp, she was able to reach higher and pull more parts back down. Azil continued upward, twisting her body as she struggled to pull herself out. Finally, she freed herself and now stood above the hole she had created. From the top of the heap, Azil turned back toward the village. There wasn't a single Fid in sight. It appeared everyone had gone inside for the evening. The blindness was getting worse, and she knew she needed to do the same. She slowly and carefully began her descent toward the village, but realized she'd never make it home in time at that pace. I don't have time for this, I need to run, she thought. As she awkwardly ran down the side of the uneven pile of metal, Azil tripped over something solid, which sent her tumbling. Head over heels, she bounced, banging against large pieces of metal and sending smaller parts flying in all directions. Finally, when she came to a stop at the bottom of the heap, she paused for a moment, then carefully returned to her feet. What was that? Wondered Azil, shaking her head. She looked back to see what caused her to fall. There, halfway up the heap, she noticed something unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a small, but very strange-looking box. A box of any kind was an unusual object to see in the heap. She was very familiar with the wide variety of metal parts that could be found within the huge pile, most of which she'd seen before or used in previous inventions. However, this was something completely unique. She hastily climbed back up to the box, picked it up and examined it closely. There were subtle details which highlighted the simplicity of its design. The edges and corners of the box were sharp and perfectly preserved, which baffled Azil. There was something else about it that confused her. As she rotated the box in her hands, she heard something rattling around inside. This mystery instantly piqued Azil's curiosity, and she wanted to know what was making the rattling sound. Unfortunately, she was unable to find an easy way to open the box. There has to be a way to get this thing open, she thought. By this time, the blindness was beginning to impair her vision. She knew she needed to get home and start idling soon, before she lost her sight completely. Luckily for her, most of the Fids would be home idling by now, so it would be less likely that she'd be harassed for bringing the metal box into the village. With the box clutched tightly in one hand, Azil swiftly darted away from the heap on her short journey across the village to her house. Chapter 4. The Arden Box. Early the next morning, Azil was back in her workshop testing the actinvorometer. She observed it proudly as everything looked to be running smoothly. This is it. Exactly how I imagined it, she thought. The satisfaction she felt increased as she watched the shiny new sprumkit silently oscillating back and forth on the machine's surface. Perfect, Azil thought. But she knew the barometer's real measure of success would be determined on the following day, when Voda got her hands on it. Azil couldn't wait to see how it would perform out in the swamp. Although it seemed to be functioning as she had hoped, she really wasn't sure if it would work for its intended purpose. The only thing Azil was sure of in that moment was her own level of satisfaction. She truly felt like she had created something special and unique. Other than the fact that it was composed of metal, it was unlike anything she had made before. Its curvilinear form reminded her of one of the tiny squirrels she had seen clinging to plants along the edge of the wetlands. Azil knew its form, as interesting as it was, couldn't compare with the internal moving mechanisms that made it work. Its delicate engineering was her finest achievement yet. It was a proud moment for her, and she knew her father would have felt the same. Gently placing the actinvorometer aside, Azil shifted her attention to the mysterious metal box she found at the heap. She didn't realize how dirty it was when she found it. The box was covered with a mixture of rust and swamp muck. Azil wondered as she looked down at a bucket of water next to her workbench. Her father had set it there to catch rainwater, which occasionally leaked through the workshop's corroded ceiling. She reached down and dipped the small metal box into the bucket of water. When she pulled it back out, her eyes widened in amazement. To her surprise, the box was made of the same shiny Arden metal as the sprumkit. Azil could not believe this amazing coincidence. Finding two objects made of the same rare type of metal on the same day was next to impossible. She had only seen a few examples of this metal in all her years of searching throughout the swamp. Now it made sense to her why the box seemed so strong and sturdy. The excitement of the Arden metal only lasted a moment, as Azil quickly realized the box was going to be a lot more difficult to get into than she originally thought. She inspected the box closely and noticed a small slit with a round hole at the top. This is strange, she thought without much concern. With her ear up to the box, Azil shook it, curiously listening as she tried to determine what may be inside. The box appeared to contain not one but multiple tiny metal objects. What could possibly be in here? She wondered. Impatiently, she tossed the metal box down on her workbench, grabbed a hammer and started banging. She hit the metal box over and over without any luck. Nothing. Not even a dent. She shouted. Azil was desperate to figure out what was inside, and she didn't want to waste any more time. Immediately, she grabbed the handsaw that was hanging on the wall next to her. As she held the box firmly against the workbench with one hand, she began hacking away at its solid metal exterior with the other. Her arms smoothly forced the saw back and forth with a powerful, continuous motion. After a short period of time, friction between the saw blade and the box had begun to generate sparks, along with piercing screeches. Azil paused and examined the box. The handsaw did nothing, not a cut, not even a scratch. Not only did it not make a scratch in the box, all the teeth on the saw blade had been ground into small metal shavings and fallen off. She tossed the handsaw down onto the floor in disgust. What is it going to take? Thought Azil, looking around the workshop for a possible solution. For her next attempt at getting into the box, she used a different kind of saw, a much stronger and larger one. To secure the box, she clamped it in place using the vise attached to her workbench. This saw was a lot better than the handsaw because it had a powerful motor that rapidly moved a large chain with dozens of razor-sharp teeth. In the past, her father had warned her many times not to use the power saw. He said it was both too unpredictable and extremely dangerous. But her father was gone, and she was desperate to get into the box. She held the saw tightly as the motor started and the blade began to move. Because of the size and weight of the saw, it was awkward for her to handle. Azil slowly brought the blade down and made contact with the small metal box. Immediately, the saw ricocheted off the box back toward her, with its whirling blades smashing against her arm. The impact created a small, yet intense, explosion that shot sparks and chunks of metal all over the workshop. The saw had been obliterated, but to Azil's surprise, her arm was not damaged. And just like the Arden box, there was not even a scratch on it. Like a freaking lark. I knew I was dent-resistant, but I had no idea Azil couldn't believe what she had just experienced. One of her arms, which were probably the smallest parts of her body, had destroyed a powerful saw. Somehow, Azil had always been under the impression that although her body was dent-resistant, there were certain things in her environment that could cause serious and irreversible damage. And power saws were near the top of the list. What she had just experienced proved otherwise. Am I made of the same stuff as this box? Are all of us made of Arden? She wondered. Before she could ponder the possibility any further, Azil was abruptly interrupted. Oh, Azil, she turned to see her mother standing in the entrance to the workshop. What are you doing in here? Nothing much. Azil shifted her body to one side, attempting to block the two saws she had destroyed. You're going to wake up the whole village with all that noise. Sorry, Mum. Please just promise me you'll keep it down. Were you still idling? Yes, and those horrible sounds you were making. Her mother held her hands up. Please, no more noise. Azil noticed that her mother didn't seem like her usual chipper self. Mom, are you okay? Suddenly her mother perked up, as if she was worried she was being perceived as a downer. Of course, Azil. I feel amazing, she said, nodding and smiling. Yes, amazing. Azil wished she could believe that were true, but she knew her mother too well. Like most of the other Fids, she masked her true feelings behind a facade of positive words and smiles. This bothered Azil deeply. If she had a choice between someone's authentic disapproval or a fake smile, she would always prefer to know how they really felt. She would much rather they be honest. Normally, when someone approached Azil demonstrating this type of insincerity, she simply avoided the interaction. Throughout her life, the orthogonal attitude deterred Azil from so many conversations and interactions with other Fids. Azil's yearning for authenticity had made it difficult for her to develop deeper, more meaningful relationships even with her own mother. I'm really sorry about all the noise, Mom. No need to be sorry, Easy. The sound really doesn't bother me. Her mother turned to leave and glanced back. But the neighbors, yes, I know, said Azil, nodding. We don't want to bother them. Her mother smiled and began to walk away. Trust me, Azil said, raising her voice. Nobody will hear any more loud noises coming out of this room. She knew she could make that promise because her two loudest tools were now completely useless. After her mother had left, Azil turned back toward her workbench and examined the metal box, which remained pressed in the vise. She looked closely and noticed a design that wrapped from its top around the sides. But odder than the design was the realization that someone at some point had etched these strange geometric patterns into its surface. This made no sense to her because she had been completely unable to cut into the box at all. How in the swamp? Azil thought as she continued to examine the box. After all she had put it through, its corners were still perfectly sharp, and there wasn't a scratch on it. Is this thing indestructible? She wondered. Then she glanced down at the arm she had nearly chopped off. It too was unscratched. Are we all indestructible? Suddenly Azil felt a surge of confidence. She had never even pondered this idea as a possibility. Clearly, this was not something her society ever talked about. All she ever heard about while growing up were warnings about what to stay away from. Warnings about where not to go, warnings about Blark-a-Lark, warnings about everything. And for what, she thought? If we are truly indestructible, what are we all so worried about? The confidence she had just experienced was quickly replaced by feelings of confusion and anger. Her society had always made little sense to her, but now she felt they were truly lost. It seemed to Azil that so many things they believed about their world contradicted what she knew to be true. Throughout her life, she had observed the actions of other Fids, actions that seemed illogical from her perspective. Shallow conversations, irrational fears, trivial motivations, all of this hinted at an elusive truth, something much deeper and perhaps more sinister than she could imagine. It was all very puzzling to Azil. Puzzle, she wondered, taking the item box in her hands. Could this be some kind of puzzle? She knew that puzzles were not common in the village and had pretty much been banned. Most of the Fids considered them as another form of Blark-a-Lark because they required unnecessary effort to solve. Azil's father didn't agree and had created several puzzles for her to play with when she was younger. But this puzzle was different from any she had ever seen because there didn't appear to be any moving parts. Is it some kind of inside-out puzzle? Maybe the moving parts are on the inside, she thought as she removed the box from the vise and held it up to her eye. Azil peeked through the small opening and noticed what looked like tiny mechanical parts. Although it wasn't clear to her what she was looking at, she was determined to understand more. She rotated the box and looked at all the sides. She noticed a subtle gap which wrapped around the outside. This must be how the box was able to open in the first place. And if that's how it opened before, Azil grabbed a small metal tool with a flat end, jammed it into the gap, and tried to pry it open. Just as she had expected, this only resulted in bending the tool. Prying it open was not going to work. Azil realized that if this really was a puzzle, like she thought, it would require more mental understanding than physical force. Azil was completely stumped. She put the box back down on her workbench and began to look around her shop. Next, she rummaged through several bins and found one that contained a bunch of small pieces of metal. She then grabbed a handful of small nails and pins and placed them on her workbench. Taking a pin in one hand and holding the box in the other, Azil carefully inserted the sharp end into the tiny opening. She tried everything she could think of. She poked and twisted the pin around, then repeated the process with a small nail, all with no success. What if I tried something that was bent, she wondered. Azil dropped the nail and picked up a narrow piece of wire. She proceeded to bend the tip of the wire and pushed it into the hole. Still nothing, although she did notice that the wire was able to reach some of the mechanical parts the nail couldn't. What if, she thought as she placed the box down on her workbench and picked up the nail with her free hand? With the nail in one hand and the piece of wire in the other, Azil inserted both into the tiny hole. She wiggled the wire around and immediately heard a click. With that, the box popped open. As she peered inside, her excitement shifted to instant confusion. "What the block?" she shouted, dropping the nail and wire onto her workbench. Her eyes grew wide as she gazed at the object inside the box. It was a necklace. She began to tremble as she anxiously took the necklace into her hands and examined it closely. Dozens of tiny polished metal shapes dangled on a circular wire. How did this get here? Thought Azil, her mind racing. She expected to find something new and interesting when she opened the box, but what she held in her hands defied all logic. It wasn't something new after all, but something she knew very well. It was the same necklace she made for her father when she was young, and it was the same necklace he had worn every day of his life until his norphoonication. Chapter 5. Jealousy. There were only a few places in the swamp Fids were willing to go. One of those locations was just outside the village, beyond the meandering growth roots near a small murky pond. It wasn't the pond or its thin layer of slimy green film that drew them away from the village. There was only one reason most Fids would even consider risking that much comfort and safety, and that was to gather pobs. Fortunately, this spot was perfect for picking Wanzalu pobs. These soft brown tubes grew at the very top of nearly every Wanzalu plant, just within reach of even the shortest middy. Clusters of these plants with their long thin stems could be found all throughout the swamp, but there was something particularly special about the ones growing around the small pond they were the closest. Picking Wanzalu pobs was probably the most difficult thing many Fids would do throughout their entire lives. But this wasn't Azil's reason for avoiding the task. She just didn't like pobs. The mere sight of a Wanzalu pob reminded her of how much she despised buffing and everything it stood for. To her, buffing was completely unnecessary. Not only did she believe it served no useful purpose, she viewed it as a symbol of what bothered her most about the Fid society, their fixation on the appearance of their bodies. Azil felt their obsession with looks overshadowed what really mattered, what was inside. Whether it was the gears driving one of her gadgets or the passion for inventing that drove her, Azil knew there was more to someone or something than its shiny surface. Despite Azil's disgust for Wanzalu pobs, Voda had once again convinced her to head out to the pond. Azil's only condition was that they'd leave the village early enough to avoid the possibility of running into other pickers. Unfortunately for her, that is exactly what happened. When Azil and Voda got to the pond, they were greeted by the cheerful smiles of Amble Pramp and her new son, Nibbly. Azil hadn't seen either of them since the festival and was glad to see Nibbly again. She wasn't particularly happy to see his mother. Azil had known Amble since they were noobs and always felt they were nothing alike. When it came to buffing, the girl had always been a shining example of what nearly every Fid hoped to achieve. Azil couldn't remember a time when the surface of Amble's body wasn't polished to a lustrous mirror-like finish. Aside from the obvious differences in their buffing habits, there were other physical contrasts between the two of them. Amble always appeared much more delicate than Azil. Even now, as a big, her arms and legs still looked fairly thin compared to Azil's. Differences like these weren't usual. Among the Fids, there was a wide array of physical diversity. Azil never understood why each Fid looked the way they did. Aside from the differences in everyone's sizes and shapes, there were more subtle variations Azil had noticed. Seemingly random notches, bulges, grooves, ridges, bumps and indentations could be found along the surface and contours of nearly every Fid's body. Although no one spoke publicly about these anomalies, Azil knew that most viewed them as mysterious flaws, imperfections for the unlucky. When it came to these rare features, Azil realized others probably thought she was the unluckiest Fid ever. The surface of Azil's upper body, in particular, appeared quite different from most. Compared to Amble's smooth, slender arms, Azil's arms were thicker with more surface details. A row of several round indentations lined the inside of her forearms, while narrow ridges ran from her shoulders to her hands. Those were her more obvious features. Up close, Azil noticed even more of these subtle anomalies. Most of the time, she was proud of these differences. She was proud of anything that set her apart and allowed her to express her individuality. But there were other times when she was alone with her thoughts that she secretly wondered if there was something seriously flawed about her. And the sight of Amble's impeccable buffed form didn't help either. That morning, while Amble was off with Voda picking pobs on the other side of the pond, Azil got to spend a little quality time with Nuble. Sitting on the ground outside the ring of Onzolu plants, she watched him curiously as he experimented with an unfamiliar substance. Nuble beamed with excitement as he took another handful of mud, pressed it between his hands, and then plopped it down beside him. "How many is that?" asked Azil, pointing to his latest creation. Turning his small body one way, then the other, he counted each tiny pile of mud. "8. Close, you have 7. She watched Nuble closely as he gathered several short sticks. "What are you going to do with those?" "I'm making a little village," he said, pushing one of the sticks into a mud pile. "These sticks are groaks and the mud's the houses." Azil was amazed at how creative Nuble was, especially at such a young age. There was always one special quality she noticed about noobs. It appeared they had a much more intuitive understanding of their world than their parents. It was as if something happened to Fids from the point of being a noob through their MIDI phase that caused them to become more and more closed off to new things and experiences. Sitting in the mud with Nuble, Azil looked up and was greeted by another happy little face. Voda's niece just excitedly approached her, showing off all her new fuzzy brown pobs. "Azil, look at all the sprobs I found." Azil smiled back as she looked at them. "Sprobs, ha. They're perfect, perfect," said Voda, narrowing her eyes. "I know you better than that." Gersa noticed Nuble busily making things with mud and looked up at her aunt. "Do you want to play with Nuble?" Voda asked. Gersa nodded, then handed the pobs to her. "You can sit here, Gersa," said Azil, getting up out of the mud. Voda looked down at Azil's legs. "You might want to—" She handed one of the pobs to her. "Here, thanks," Azil said as she smeared some of the wet mud around. "So where did Nuble's mother go?" "Amble. I guess she needed to go back to the village for something." "What a surprise," Azil said, rolling her eyes at the thought of Amble, or any other Fid, having to transition from a lifetime of folly to suddenly becoming a responsible parent. "Let me guess," Voda said. "You don't think Amble's a very good mother." "It's not that. I just don't think she really gets the whole mum thing yet. Becoming a mom is a big step one that we'll be going through in a year." "Nuo," Azil said, putting her hands over her ears. "Please don't remind me. I'm nowhere near ready to be a mother." "Speaking of mothers," Voda said, smiling. "What did yours say when you told her about your father's necklace?" Azil shrugged. "You didn't even tell her, did you?" Voda said, slowly shaking her head. "Though you don't understand my mom. Something like that would only confuse her." "Are you sure?" "Yeah, I bet she thought that necklace was just another annoying piece of blark I made." "I doubt that. Your father wore it all the time. She would have said something if it really bothered her." Azil laughed. "You clearly don't know my mother like I do." "Maybe, but I'm sure she misses your father." "Well, him," Azil said pensively. "That might explain why she's been acting even stranger than normal lately." "What do you mean?" "How has she been acting?" "She's always been worried about my brother and I, but it seems to be getting worse." Azil's eyes suddenly grew wide, and she's been idling constantly, well, much more than usual. "Really? That's weird. My father's been like that too. He's always idling." "You mean since your mother?" Voda tilted her head to one side. "Come to think of it, he's been like that for a couple years now." "Your father," Azil said, narrowing her eyes. "But he always seems so energized. Well, he is when he's out in the village doing his thing. But at home, he's different. Different? How? I'm not sure exactly. It's like he's bored or something." "Asdor the ultimate? The leader of all Fids? Big and noob is bored?" Azil shook her head. "I find that hard to believe." That's because you've never seen him like that. Nobody outside of our house has seen that side of him. The last thing he'd ever want is for anyone to think he's being a downer. Azil noticed Nubli's mother. Amble had returned, and she wasn't alone. Bowden was right by her side. Something about Amble always annoyed Azil, and seeing the two of them together was especially irritating. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that Amble, who had always been shorter than Azil, was now much taller. I'm back, and I brought a friend, Amble said. Where? Said Voda, looking behind them. Oh, you mean my brother? Bowden smirked at her. Amble turned to Voda. I missed the festival. Did you miss the festival? Yeah, I guess so. Me too. The village was more fun during the festival. Amble tilted her head to one side. Hey, I was wondering, does your dad have any funsies planned? Voda shrugged. Not that I know of. Azil couldn't believe what she was hearing. Amble, like most of the other Fids, had no idea what to do with herself and constantly needed to be entertained. This desire caused her, and many others, to always wonder about Lazov's next ridiculous activity. Bowden walked over to his daughter and picked her up out of the mud. Jersa smiled and kicked her legs as he held her up in front of him. How's my little Wanzalu Pob? I'm muddy, she said. Bowden smiled. I see. He gently placed Jersa down on the ground beside him and turned to Voda, noticing the Pobs. It looks like you two have been busy. Yes, we have. Leaning down, Voda gently handed the Pobs to Gersa. Your daughter is now an expert Pob plucker. Her eyes suddenly grew wide. Oh. And she now knows the names of nearly every bug in the swamp. He looked at Gersa, smiling proudly. Is that true? Gersa smiled and nodded. Sounds like I missed all the fun. Bowden turned to his sister. Thanks, Auntie Vo. It was my pleasure. I would have been here earlier, but I had some things I needed to take care of in my workshop. What were you working on? Azil asked. Just fixing some things. Bowden shrugged. Nothing interesting. Azil noticed this wasn't the first time Bowden downplayed his workshop activities. In fact, she had never even seen the inside. Perhaps even stranger, she had never seen a single invention he'd made. Amble turned to Bowden and grinned. You're so modest. I'm sure whatever it is very interesting. Azil shook her head. She knew Amble couldn't care less about any of his projects. Bowden smiled at Amble and lowered his head. Well, all of a sudden, Nibli jumped up out of the mud, shouting, Mommy! Mommy! He ran to Amble and wrapped his tiny arms around her leg. Amble's face went sour. What are you doing? Nubly cautiously released her leg and looked up at her. Mommy, I missed you. Ignoring him, she looked down at her mud-covered leg. Mud all over my freshly buffed. Bowden quickly reached down, grabbed one of Jess's Pobs, and handed it to Amble. She frantically rubbed it against her muddy leg, smearing it around. It's getting worse. Amble reached down and grabbed all of Jess's remaining Pobs and continued her frantic rubbing. She threw the muddy Pobs on the ground and looked at her leg. Ew, it's not coming off. She looked up at Bowden and smiled awkwardly. I think I want to go back to the village. Okay, Bowden said, nodding. He gently put a hand on her back. I understand. This is exactly why I don't like leaving the village, Amble said sullenly. Everywhere else in the swamp is just too nucky. Well, let me walk you back. Bowden turned to Gersa and held out a hand. Are you ready to go home? She grabbed his hand and nodded. Then she looked back at the pile of muddy Pobs on the ground. Voda walked over to Gersa and patted her on the head. Don't worry, I'll pick some more for us. Bowden looked at his sister. Thanks for keeping an eye on her. It was my pleasure, Voda said, smiling. Amble turned to Voda. Yeah, thanks for watching, Nubs. It wasn't me, Voda said. Azil's the one. Oh, said Amble, quickly glaring at Azil before turning to go. Bowden and Amble left for the village, taking the noobs with them. As soon as they were out of earshot, Azil turned to Voda, shaking her head. I don't know how you can be friends with her. Who, Amble? She's not that bad. That's what you think. Azil said, kicking the pile of muddy Pobs. Well, I can't stand her. Aze, how can you say that? You don't even really know her. I know enough, said Azil, casually wiping some of the dry mud off her arm. Nothing about her annoys you. Just because she acts different than I do doesn't mean I should think there's something wrong with her. Azil slowly shook her head. I don't know how you do it. Do what you can tolerate, you can body. Voda laughed. Coming from the girl who tolerates nobody. I tolerate you, Azil said, grinning. Besides, I know the real reason you don't like Amble. What are you talking about? You're jealous. Jealous of what? The fact that she's taller than me now, possibly. But that's not what I was thinking about. Well, whatever you're thinking, it's wrong. Azil crossed her arms and laughed. I am definitely not jealous of Amble Pramp. Okay, if you say so. Voda grinned and looked down at Azil's muddy legs. I know you don't like buffing, but you might want to think about doing something about the mud. Azil looked down at her legs and chuckled. What, you don't like it? Well, maybe it's my new thing. Voda laughed. Hey, speaking of your new thing, when am I going to see that mysterious metal box you were talking about? Whenever you want, Azil said, shrugging. Voda's eyes widened. I've got an idea. Why don't you stay over tonight? And bring the box. Sure. And you can bring my present too. No, Azil said, shaking her head. Not until tomorrow. You'll be needing it for our trip out to the edge of the wetlands. So that's why you insisted on going out there. Yes, it has to do with your gift. What in the swamp did you make me this time? Voda asked, squinting her eyes. Sure you can't give me one little hint. The wetlands, Azil said, crossing her arms. Figure it out. Voda looked down at the muddy pobs scattered across the ground. Looks like I need to pick some more pobs. Azil grinned. Good luck with that. Sure you don't want to stay and help? No thanks. Azil held out her arms and looked down at the patches of mud on her body. I've got something I need to take care of before coming over later. She shrugged and started walking away. Voda called out to her. Yeah. You don't want Amble showing you up. With her back to Voda, Azil shouted. Once again, I'm not jealous of Amble Pramp. Chapter 6. Suspicion. The inside of Voda's room was similar to all the rooms in all the fid houses throughout the village. The floor was dirt with patches of muddy water and the moss-covered roots of nearby swamp growths. The walls were made from hardened mud, which had been cracking gradually under the pressure of larger encroaching roots. On one of the walls, there was a round window, which allowed the soft green glow from outside to fill the room throughout the day. None of these details were unusual and could be seen in nearly every room in every home in the village. The one thing that set Voda's room apart from all the others was the unmistakable presence of a wide variety of bizarre metal objects. Dozens of them, in the form of accessories, toys, and gadgets, were organized neatly on the floor around the edges of her room. Seeing all the projects she had made throughout the course of her cycle filled Azil with pride every time she came to visit. That was one of the reasons why Voda's room had always been one of Azil's favorite places to hang out. Sitting on two of the thick roots that protruded up through the floor, Azil and Voda watched Gersa, who was curiously examining the necklace. Azil smiled and slowly shook her head. I still can't believe your brother is now a father. I know, you should see the two of them together, complete opposites. Gersa always wants to play and Boden is always so serious and worried she'll get lost or break something. He just can't relax. Azil watched Gersa investigating her father's necklace. And she seemed so inquisitive. She is? She wants to know about everything. No kidding, Azil said, laughing. I couldn't believe it when she asked your father where all the missing fids went. Voda took the necklace from Gersa and handed it back to Azil, who carefully returned it to the small circular compartment in her abdomen. Voda giggled. You and your bubbit what? Oh, Azil looked up at her and smirked. It's useful. Haven't you ever put anything in there? No. Voda crossed her arms for a moment, then suddenly dropped them. Okay, maybe when I was a curious little noob and didn't know any better. Well, I'm not too concerned about it. I'm going to stick things in there and I don't care what anyone thinks. I'm sure you will, said Voda, rolling her eyes. She picked up the strange metal box Azil had brought over and began to examine it closely. I can't believe that story about your father's necklace. It just doesn't make sense why somebody would have sealed it in this box. And then take it and throw it in the heap like it's a piece of junk. I don't understand any of it. Azil lowered her head and slowly paced around the room, then came to a stop in front of Voda. If the great glow took my father, then wouldn't it have taken his necklace too? Isn't that how it works? Voda shrugged. I don't know, have never heard of it leaving anything behind. That's just it. I've never understood this whole norphoonication process. The thought of fids just disappearing, it makes absolutely no sense. I know I've never really understood it much either. Voda paused for a moment and tilted her head. Maybe we're overthinking this. The necklace was sealed in a metal box in the heap. What fid do you know who likes the heap? Azil squinted as she pondered the question. Me? Exactly you. What are you talking about? Are you saying I sealed my father's necklace in this box and tossed it into the heap and forgot the whole thing? Voda smiled and spoke calmly. No, I'm saying, what if your father wanted you to have the necklace? Maybe before he was norfed, he put it in a place where he knew only you would find it the heap. That makes no sense, said Azil, crossing her arms. Why wouldn't he have just given it to me or left it in our workshop? Plus, Whoever put it in that box didn't want it to be seen again ever. Azil glanced down at the metal box in Voda's hands. You know how hard it was for me to get in there? I couldn't even put a dent in that thing. Really? Voda held the metal box up and looked at it closely. Oh, that's right, you'll never believe, said Azil, remembering what she had been wanting to tell Voda. That box you're holding, it's made of the exact same kind of metal as we are. What? No way. Voda re-examined the box curiously. I didn't know there was anything made from the same metal as us. Yes, it's called Artem. Artem? Never heard of it. Azil shrugged. Seriously? The rarest metal in Zovia? It must not be too rare if we're made of it. Well, that's true. Anyway, I think it's indestructible. Indestructible. I highly doubt that, Voda said, narrowing her eyes. If Artem was indestructible, that would make us indestructible, too. I think we are. Yeah, right, Voda said, rolling her eyes. I wish. Azil grinned and shook her head. Though you have no idea. Okay. Then if this Artem box is indestructible, how were you able to get inside? Azil pointed to something on the box in Voda's hands. See this tiny hole? I was able to pick at it with these. She removed a wire and nail from her bibit and demonstrated. And the box just popped right open, she said, turning her palms up quickly. Voda examined the hole in the Artem box. I've seen that kind of hole before. I think it's called a keyhole. Keyhole? How do you know that? My brother's workshop, the one we're never allowed in, it has one of those on the outside of the door. Really? I never noticed it before, said Azil, her eyes growing wide. Yeah, I asked him about it one day and he got kind of defensive. Do you think he's hiding something in there? I don't know, he keeps it sealed shut, even when he's inside. I'm not even sure how he gets in there, probably the same way I got into that box. I wonder if he would know anything about it. What? This thing. Voda held the metal box in the air. That doesn't make any sense. Why would he know anything about this box? A box that held your father's necklace. I don't know. Nothing else seems to make any sense. Voda shrugged. Maybe the Great Glow left it behind, because it couldn't be turned back into usable energy. If that's true, why would it seal the necklace in a box, and why would it have just dropped the box into the heap? Maybe it landed somewhere in the village and another Fid thought it was just some lark and got rid of it. Azil imagined the probability of the Great Glow enclosing her father's necklace in the Artem box and then dropping it in the village was next to impossible. How often have you seen metal falling from the sky? Azil asked. I've never seen it. I think if metal was falling from the sky, we would know it. That would be pretty obvious and loud. Or maybe the Great Glow got confused and sent it by accident when it sent the noobs. Azil stood abruptly and turned toward Voda. Wait, wasn't Boden there with your father when the noobs arrived? Yes, I think so. Voda lifted her head, becoming distracted by a faint rustling sound in the hallway. I think my brother's home if you want me to ask him. Azil's eyes widened. Yeah, he might know something. Voda stepped out into the hallway and grabbed her brother's arm as he passed by. With her other hand, she held the metal box up in front of Boden's face. Have you ever seen this before? Boden was caught off guard and appeared a bit stunned. He paused for a moment as he looked around nervously. Yes, what was the question again? He asked, avoiding eye contact. Azil got up, grabbed the box from Voda, and showed it to Boden as she impatiently rephrased the question. Was this box with the noobs when they arrived or appeared or whatever? Yes, said Boden, glancing down at the box. I guess the Great Glow must have accidentally sent it. Azil sensed he wasn't being completely truthful and pushed him further. Well, what did you do with it when you found it? Boden shrugged. I didn't know what to do with it. So I took it to the heap like we're supposed to do with all lark. So you didn't even wonder what was inside? Asked Azil, staring up at him. No, I thought it was just junk. Seriously? How could you think this amazing box was suddenly? A grin crept onto Azil's face, and she began to nod. Oh, you must have seen it when it was covered with dirt. Maybe you should take a closer look. She lifted the Artem box and held it in front of his face. Boden pushed the box aside without looking at it. I don't know anything about it or anything else. What does that mean? Azil said, shrugging. He started to move past her, but she instinctively shifted her body, cutting him off. Boden, you can tell me. Azil got closer and whispered in his ear. You trust me, right? He looked at her, nodded unconvincingly, then continued past her. Azil turned and stared at Voda, looking for clarity, but Voda could only shrug. Boden poked his head into Voda's room and motioned to his daughter. Come on, Jersa. The blindness is coming. We need to get you ready to idle. Jersa got up and took his hand. Boden and his daughter silently walked past Azil down the hall. His bizarre behavior and lack of detail left Azil with a mind full of questions. She walked over Voda, hoping she could help make sense of what just happened. Why was your brother acting so strange? Don't let it bother you, he always acts that way. I've never seen him like that. Well, you're lucky. Azil slowly rotated the Arden box in her hands. All that. And he didn't even wonder what was in the box. He just wanted to get his daughter ready to idle. Azil wearily sat back down on the root. None of this makes any sense. Have you ever actually witnessed someone being norphed? Voda looked at her sincerely and shook her head. Only my father has seen it happen, and maybe Bowden. They've never really talked about it. They're secretive about a lot of things like that. What do they say when you ask about all these strange things? I don't like to bother them with those kinds of questions. What important questions, said Azil, crossing her arms. I'm just afraid they'll think I'm being a downer. You a downer? You're one of the most positive Fids I know. If anything, your brother's the downer, being so quiet and secretive. Azil looked down at the box in her hands. What was it about this thing that had him so freaked out? I'm sure he was just concerned about getting Jersa ready to idle. And speaking of idling, it's about time we did the same. Yeah, I guess you're right, Azil said, gently placing the box down beside her. Voda walked to the door, then turned back toward Azil. I need to wish my father a good night. I'll be right back. Azil silently watched Voda leave the room and then looked down at the box on the floor. All she could think about was the strange, one-sided conversation she had with Bowden. I know he's hiding something, she thought. I've never known anyone to seal a door to keep others out. He has to be hiding something in that room. That's the only explanation. Even his own sister has never been in there. And the hole in the door, the same kind of hole as the one in this box. Once again, Azil picked up the Arden box and curiously examined the tiny hole. I need to know what he's hiding in that workshop, she thought. I wonder if I could solve the puzzle on that door like I did with this box. Azil knew she couldn't rest without getting some answers. What if I acted like I was preparing to idle, but never actually went through with it? She wondered. She had considered this idea several times when she was younger, but never went through with it because of fear. The blindness had been known to cause a loss of clarity and awareness. There were legends of Fids not knowing where they were going and becoming lost in the swamp forest. Azil cringed as she recalled the horrific ways these stories ended, usually with a dramatic dismembering at the claws of the Groken. Another story told of an individual who became completely unclear of his surroundings. This unlucky Fid ran around in the blindness until he smashed into a large jagged shard of steel. Apparently, he was so traumatized he never returned to the village again. Azil was never quite sure if his absence was due to a permanent disfigurement or severe emotional embarrassment. These stories had always caused her to think twice about trying to move around at night, but recent revelations had caused her to reconsider. If we really are indestructible, then why have we been so afraid of the blindness? Why do we fear anything? This epiphany and her need for answers filled Azil with a renewed sense of confidence and determination. I need to know what is going on, and I'm not going to stop until I get some answers. Chapter 7. Bowden's Workshop. Blindness had now fully descended upon everyone in the house as well as the village. The normal procedure among the Fids was to idle throughout the entire night. But on this night, there would be one exception. Ever since the discovery of the necklace and her more recent run-in with Bowden, Azil's mind was buzzing with questions. Her desire for answers would not subside, and she needed to know what Bowden was hiding in his workshop. I know he's hiding something in there, she thought as she waited patiently for Voda to return from wishing her father a good night. Azil had no idea what she'd find in Bowden's workshop or if she could even get inside. She wasn't really sure what she was doing. All she knew is that she needed to do something, anything that provided a chance of uncovering the truth in her father, the necklace, and her newfound indestructibility. When Voda returned, Azil gave the impression that she was all ready to idle. Voda looked at her suspiciously. Since when are you ready to idle before me? Azil shrugged. You know, the sooner we idle, the sooner tomorrow comes. Yes, and I can't wait. I finally get my Akachon present. That's it, Azil said, crossing her arms. I'm not giving you the unconventional until you learn how to say it properly. Well, excuse me. What do you expect? You gave that thing a weird name, even weirder than any of the other gifts you've given me. Voda extended an arm and turned gracefully as she recognized all of Azil's strange creations. You know what you look like, Azil said, giggling. That's exactly what you did when you introduced all those eager newbies to their MIDI mentors last year. Well, that was my way of letting you know how much I appreciate everything you've made for me, even if they do have crazy names I can't pronounce. But that's part of what makes them so interesting. Just promise me you'll try to pronounce your new gift correctly. Nah, I don't think so, Voda said with a mischievous grin. Maybe I'll call it my bubbit meter. Azil laughed. Now you're definitely not getting it. Oh, really? I was just kidding. I'm actually a bit curious to know what it does and what it has to do with the wetlands. You'll see, said Azil, grinning. Now I'm too excited to idle. Azil's eyes widened as she thought of something she hadn't previously considered. When you said goodnight to your father, did you ask him if he knew anything about the box with my father's necklace? No. That would have been difficult. Why? Are you afraid he'd think you're being a downer? Not exactly. It would have been difficult because he was already idling again. Didn't he idle before I got here? He did, and still is. And I thought my mother idled a lot. Azil straightened her arms down by her side as a subtle hint. Speaking of, Voda rolled her eyes as she mimicked Azil's posture. If we must, after wishing each other well, the two friends began the process of powering down. With their arms by their sides, they closed their eyes and stood perfectly still. At least that's what Voda did. Azil, however, moved ever so slightly to avoid slipping into an idle which would most likely last throughout the night. With her eyes shut, she waited patiently until she was sure Voda had completely powered down. After a while, Azil opened her eyes, completely interrupting her opening process. When she was sure the house was completely quiet and everyone was idling, she slowly and quietly began to move through the blindness. From previous experience, Azil knew that the blindness was never absolute. Even when the glow was resting, sight was still possible, although difficult. One thing she had always noticed was how the blindness had a tendency to permeate the inside of their homes more than the outside. This made it especially difficult to see indoors at night. It was also greater on some nights than others, but to her surprise on this particular night, the blindness wasn't as intense as usual. Azil continued to sneak around the house, stepping softly on the dirt floor to avoid making any loud noises. Slowly, she crept down the hallway which led to Bowden's workshop, a mysterious room she had always wondered about. On any normal day, she would have felt guilty just considering the idea of sneaking into his personal space, but after his suspicious behavior toward her, she felt she had the right to know the truth. As she continued toward the entrance to the workshop, Azil could barely see the walls beside her. Since there were no windows in this part of the house, the blindness was much greater. Quietly, she ran a hand along one of the walls of the narrow hallway until she touched the door to the workshop. Feeling around with her hand, she successfully located the doorknob. She immediately tried to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Then she reached out with both arms and firmly pushed against the entire door. It didn't budge either. It appeared to be stronger and sturdier than any door she had ever known. With her ear up to the door, she gently tapped and noticed a familiar sound. The door sounded like it was made of metal. This is really strange, she thought. I've never heard of someone having a metal door. Due to the blindness in the hallway, she was unable to see the tiny hole that Voda told her about. What did she call it? Azil wondered. Yes, a keyhole. Feeling around, Azil was soon able to locate the small indentation of the hole. She carefully removed the small nail and piece of wire she had stored in her bubit as she pondered the absurdity of the situation. Here I am standing in the blindness of Voda's house, trying to sneak into her brother's workshop, using a technique I just learned for an inside-out puzzle I've never heard of on a door made of metal. She slowly inserted the bent piece of wire into the hole in the door and carefully slid the nail in alongside of it. Azil had learned a lot from her long struggle with the keyhole puzzle on the Autumn box and hoped the one on the door was similar. She knew that she needed to use the wire to feel around for the small mechanical parts, while simultaneously pushing the nail against a solid part inside. After a moment of probing, picking and fidgeting, she finally heard the familiar subtle popping sound she remembered hearing from the Autumn box. Oh, yeah, thought Azil, grinning as she cautiously turned the knob. Just as she was about to push the door open, she was overcome with a sudden feeling of guilt. What am I doing? She thought. Bowden doesn't deserve this. She knew if anyone were to invade her workshop, she wouldn't like it. Of course, I'd never seal my door shut to keep others out. Only a fid with something to hide would do that. With a renewed sense of confidence fueled by her desperate need for answers, Azil defiantly pushed the door open and stepped into Bowden's secret world. Entering the workshop, the first thing she noticed was the night glow that poured in through two round windows. It immediately caused most of the blindness to clear away. There was something especially peculiar about the windows themselves, something she had never seen on any other windows in the village. Both of them had 5 parallel metal rods that ran from top to bottom. Azil couldn't believe she had never noticed this before from the outside. but realized these windows were located on the back of the house where she had never been. With the night glow now overpowering the blindness, Azil was able to see much better. What is this place? She thought as she looked around. It didn't look at all like her workshop. It was much larger while somehow, simultaneously, it felt much more cramped and cluttered. This place reminded her of the heap, although it appeared to be slightly more organized. There were piles of metal parts everywhere. Many of the piles towered over her, obstructing her view. Along the wall, near the windows, Azil saw dozens of bins overflowing with smaller parts. Sprumkits. She shouted in a whisper. There must be 50 or more in here, she thought as she bent down and ran her fingers through one of the bins. To her shock, some of them appeared to be made of Ardum. Where did Bowden get all these? She wondered. That Blark, why did he never tell me about all this? He knows I love this stuff. Azil stood tall and peered around the stacks, trying to take it all in. On the far wall she spotted what looked like a workbench, although it was difficult to see, because its surface was almost completely hidden. It was covered with parts, tools, and other objects she didn't recognize. As Azil moved closer, she thought the blindness was messing with her eyes. Leaning next to Bowden's workbench were what looked to be two idling fids. One appeared to be a big and the other a new. Not only did she not recognize either of them, their bodies looked like they hadn't been buffed in ages. Who? What are they doing in here, and who idles leaning against a workbench, she thought. This made no sense to her. Azil didn't know if she should try to wake them or leave them alone. Whoever they were, she didn't want them or anybody else to know she had been in there. She decided not to disturb them and continued investigating the workbench. There on the workbench were several unfamiliar objects which immediately drew her attention. One of them appeared to be a small, yet incredibly complex, object in the shape of a disc. What is that? Azil thought curiously. She carefully picked the object up and brought it closer for investigation. It was unlike anything she'd seen before. Her eyes grew in wonder as she examined it closely. The strange disc was flat on one side and had intricate layers of patterns and symbols on the other. What do all these little shapes mean? She thought. Although Azil had heard about things like letters and symbols as unique shapes that were meant to convey specific ideas, she had never actually seen any before. Her father had explained that these were primitive forms of communication which existed many generations ago. Over time, the use of letters and symbols had been abandoned, and now, even if they were to be discovered, were considered nothing but blaka la. She was bewildered as she continued to inspect the layers of detail on the disc. Even in the blindness, she could still make out many of its unique features. But what really perplexed her were the tiny, intricate symbols etched into its layers. This is crazy, thought Azil, her eyes growing wide. I didn't know Bowden knew anything about symbols. Since she wasn't near the windows, Azil could barely see the disc in her hand. The blindness had obscured everything in the workshop, making even things that were familiar appear somehow more mysterious. The large piles of parts around her resembled strange idling beasts that she imagined might awaken at any moment. She knew these fears were irrational and returned her attention to the unusual gadget. Azil had no idea how or why Bowden would have made the disc. What is this thing supposed to be for, anyway? She wondered. She knew that Bowden wouldn't have gone through the trouble of making something so complex if it wasn't useful in some way. It's far too practical to put this much time and effort into something completely pointless. There has to be something to it. If she ever hoped to make any sense of the object in her hand, she would need to take it where she could see it more clearly. Azil carefully maneuvered back through the cramped workshop toward one of the barred windows. Reaching outward, she positioned the disc in the night globe. Rotating it in her hands, she was amazed by the intricate level of detail. She could see some of the larger symbols on the outer layer, but still couldn't make sense of any of it. What is this thing? There's no way Bowden made this. The craftsmanship alone made her doubt this object was made by any fid, at least nobody she ever knew. Even more than the disc's craftsmanship was the complexity of its numerous patterns and circular symbols. This object is absolutely amazing, she thought as she continued her analysis. Her curiosity was buzzing like never before. She knew there had to be a logical explanation for the design of this, but nothing about it made any sense. I just don't get it, thought Azil, shaking the object in frustration. She was unable to stop the flood of questions and wouldn't rest until she knew more. Maybe if I take it outside away from all this blindness into the night glow, she thought. Azil didn't waste another moment. With the disc in hand, she quickly made her way out of the cluttered workshop. When she returned to the hallway, the blindness seemed to be more intense than before. With her free hand, she slowly felt her way along the narrow corridor. Azil continued past Voda's room on her way through the rest of the house and eventually out the front door into the night glow. Chapter 8. The Strange Disc. Standing outside that night, Azil felt strange, and it didn't have anything to do with the night glow. It had more to do with the realization that, for the first time in her life, she was standing in the village completely alone. At first it gave her an eerie, uneasy feeling, but this was soon replaced by an unusual sense of serenity. Maybe it was her new understanding that she might be indestructible, or the realization that the blindness she experienced in the house had not affected her mind. Instead, Azil felt a heightened sense of clarity, immediately becoming aware of things she had never noticed before. The night glow was more prominent than she had remembered, bathing the entire village in its soft green glow. Although it lacked the same intensity as the glow during the day, it was still more intense than she had expected. The breeze also seemed quite intense, strong enough to cause the enormous growths to sway slightly. Azil listened intently, becoming aware of unfamiliar noises. The continuous sounds of various nocturnal creatures echoed throughout the swamp. It was as if they were welcoming her to what seemed to be some sort of strange and enchanting new world. Azil's fascination immediately shifted to confusion over contradiction between what she had known and what she was currently experiencing. The magical scene before her was nothing like the horrific nightmare she expected. Holding the disc tightly, she threw up her hands and looked around the empty village. So where is this vicious Grokin? Where is the danger? Where are all those horrible things I've worried about my whole life? The more time she spent outside in the night glow, the clearer it became to her that there really was nothing to fear. Have I been duped? Were we all tricked into thinking this was something to be concerned about? Standing in the soft green glow, Azil slowly rotated her body, gazing at her surroundings. This is nothing to fear. This is beautiful. Suddenly, a new realization hit Azil. All those years, all that time wasted idling, standing around like an idiot when I could have been out here in this. She felt an overwhelming sense of wonder like never before as she observed dancing shadows cast by the swaying growths. As astonishing as it all was, she only wished her friend was there with her to witness this indescribable phenomenon. Azil was so caught up in this new experience, she almost forgot why she had gone outside in the first place. The disc, thought Azil, looking down at the strange object in her hand. The night glow outside allowed her to see it much better. Now she could easily see more of the disc's elaborate detail. One thing she hadn't seen before was the clear, sparkling material that created some of its inner layers. Is that some kind of transparent metal? She wondered. She also realized there was something strangely familiar about the shape and size. Have I seen this before? Or something like it? Over the years, she had seen thousands of metal parts, but nothing quite like this. Most of the parts she had seen were very basic and usually damaged or rusted. This was highly complex and perfectly preserved. Who could have made this? Unlike most of her inventions, this object didn't seem to have any moving parts. Out of curiosity, Azil wanted to see if she could rotate the outer portion of the disc around the inner portion. She grabbed the disc firmly in both hands and tried to twist it. All of a sudden, the disc shot out of her grasp, flew through the air, and landed behind one of the large roots next to Voda's house. Azil reacted quickly, following it with her eyes. She carefully climbed over the root and searched the ground behind it. The disc was easy to see as it appeared to glisten in the night glow. Azil walked to the disc and leaned over to pick it up. At that exact same moment, the small door to her bibit popped open, spilling all of its contents, including her father's necklace, onto the ground. Azil reached down, picked up the necklace, and secured it around her neck. She then knelt down and grabbed the remainder of her belongings, as well as the disc. As she reached to put everything back into the small circular compartment in her abdomen, she had a revelation. That's where I recognized the shape from. Instead of putting her items back, she took the disc in one hand and held it up to her bibit. It appeared to be the same size and shape of the internal compartment. I wonder, she thought as she slowly pushed the disc into place. It fit perfectly. Intuitively, she gave the object a slight turn until she heard a click. Azil was then startled by another sound, this time on her back. She turned around, but there was no one behind her. Then she turned her head all the way to one side and noticed what looked like another compartment door right in the center of her back. What is that? What is happening? She twisted her torso and craned her neck in both directions, attempting to see what was inside the compartment. Next, she reached her arm around as far as it could go with no luck. As hard as she tried, all she could see or touch was the small open door itself. What the obscure compartment was for and what was inside remained a mystery. With all of this confusion, Azil nearly missed what was happening, simultaneously on the far side of the village. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed movement, causing her to look up. It was someone or something moving swiftly in her direction. Whoever or whatever it was didn't appear to notice her. She cautiously stooped down behind the large growth root in front of her to avoid being seen. Azil then slowly lifted her head and peered over the root as she began to observe the shadowy figure. Who is that? She wondered. The individual didn't look familiar in any way. She didn't know if it was a man or woman, big or midi, or even a fit at all. Could that possibly be the Groken or perhaps one of its offspring, she thought. Azil noticed her hands beginning to shake involuntarily. Come on, Az, get a grip. It's probably just some kind of strange creature that only comes out at night. The only thing she knew for certain was that this shadowy figure was sneaking, not simply going for a walk. This individual had come from the direction of the heap and looked to be carrying metal parts of various sizes. What are they doing with all that metal or any metal at all? She wondered. What confused Azil even more was the unusual material that covered the stranger's head and body. It appeared to be something similar to fur, but loose and flowing like enormous leaves. Azil had to crouch even lower as the mysterious individual walked directly in front of her. It looks like they're headed toward the swamp forest. Instead of being scared, now she was curious. She reached around, gently closed the strange little door on her back, and quietly began to follow the stranger. Just as she was moving closer to get a better look, the mysterious individual darted into the shadows of the swamp forest. Azil squinted as she peered into the blindness, looking for movement. Suddenly she spotted the stranger at the base of a growth tree. Azil watched in confusion as they effortlessly began to climb. How in the swamp? Where is this blark going? She wondered, her eyes fixed on the action. Almost instantly, the individual had disappeared up into the tree. Who goes up into the trees? Azil thought as she approached the forest. Surely no Fid would dare climb a tree, especially around here. All the Fids had grown up with stories of the Groken and other dangers within the trees, which encouraged them to keep both feet on the ground. Now, at the base of the large growth, Azil maneuvered her body around and over its thick roots. She was trying to understand how the stranger was able to get up into the tree so easily. It made no sense to her. There weren't even any low branches for the individual to have climbed up on. Azil attempted to peer farther up into the tree, but her sight was impaired by the overwhelming blindness. Realizing she would need to revisit the tree during the day, Azil turned to climb back down from the roots. Looking downward, she noticed something small and familiar tucked in between the roots by her feet. It was a kenok. Kenoks were among the most common metal parts found in the swamp, and she had used them in almost every one of her inventions. They were long and narrow with hooks on each end and were used to connect two clumpets together. What is this stranger doing with kenoks? She wondered. Other than her father and perhaps Bowden, she had never known anyone to use them. None of this makes any sense, she thought, shaking her head. First the necklace, then that crazy disc. Now this, with all the strangeness she had just experienced, Azil had begun to wonder if the blindness was somehow messing with her mind. All she wanted was answers, but somehow she just kept running into more questions. Chapter 9. Bugs. The following morning, Azil and Voda left the village early. Azil didn't mind the long walk out to the edge of the large open wetlands because she knew it would be the best place for her friend to try out the unconventional for the first time. Voda raced out ahead to the water's edge and called back to Azil. Come on, do you want to see me try this thing out? She shouted, waving the unconventional overhead. Yes, you better wait for me. Azil quickened her pace to catch up to Voda, excited to finally get to see her invention in action. She eagerly approached the large body of water, which extended out as far as she could see. Azil always felt an indescribable sense of mystery and grandeur when she visited this part of the swamp, the place where all the Fids believed the swamp and their world simply ended. Both the wetlands on this side of their village and the dense swamp forest on the other were considered to be the impenetrable limits surrounding their world. Each acted not only as a physical boundary, but as a psychological one as well. Just as the swamp forest was known for its supposed threats, the open wetlands had several dangers, including the savage gazers, which Azil had seen for herself. These creatures patrolled the waters, looking for anything that dare enter their dwelling. Any prey within striking distance of a gazer's sharp jaws would instantly be pulled below the surface, never to return. Approaching the water's edge, Azil proudly watched her friend carrying the gift she had made. She still hadn't revealed its purpose, but that didn't seem to bother Voda, who swung it through the air as she danced through the tall grass. Azil had wanted to make this invention for Voda for the longest time, and she was excited to finally see if it could actually do what she had intended. Wait up, shouted Azil, running to catch up. Voda stopped and turned toward her, holding the unconventional in both hands. Are you finally going to tell me what this thing is for? I can't believe you still don't know. Azil held out her arms and looked around at all the tall grass surrounding them. What is your favorite thing about this part of the swamp? Voda shrugged. I don't know. The view. Well, second favorite. Azil looked down and kicked her leg through the grass. Voda's eyes widened as dozens of flying insects took to the air. Bugs, she shouted cheerfully. Yes, bugs, said Azil, nodding her head. It took you long enough. It had always been clear to her that Voda absolutely loved bugs. Since they were small, Azil had watched her friend discover and collect insects from all over the swamp. Although Azil could appreciate these tiny creatures mainly for the functional aspects of their unique body type, she had no desire to collect them like her friend. A slight grin appeared on Voda's face. Now it makes sense why we came all the way out here, doesn't it? This is the best place for bugs anywhere. From previous explorations, they both knew this was the primary spot in the swamp for finding a wide variety of unique insects. Azil knew this wasn't by chance. She noticed the location provided the perfect habitat for the delicate creatures to safely congregate and flourish. The tall, thick grass that grew along the wetlands not only protected them from predators, it offered shelter from the strong breezes, which moved across the open water. Voda took another look at the actinvorometer and laughed. So how was I supposed to know this crazy gadget had anything to do with insects? She looked up to Azil and shrugged. I still don't get it. What does it do? You mean what is it supposed to do? I haven't actually tested it yet. That's what you're for. Well, what is it supposed to do? Azil smiled. You know how every time you try to catch bugs, you have problems? Yeah, Voda said, frowning. No matter how gentle I try to be, I always crush them between my fingers. Exactly. Since we were noobs, I have stood by helplessly as you smashed so many of those poor little bugs into dust. It's not like I meant to, it's just that you didn't have a safe way to catch them. Voda's eyes grew wide. Are you saying that this gadget can help me catch insects without smashing them? Yes, if it works like it should. Azil pointed to the large circular area in the center of the actinvorometer. And this part will hold your bugs temporarily until you let them out. Oh wow, Voda handed the gadget to Azil. Come on, show me how it works. It's easy. All you have to do is start it up, and it's all ready to go. Azil flipped a switch on the actinvorometer and it quietly began to hum. She pointed to an opening on one side of the machine. Put this part near a bug, and it'll get sucked right into the vorometer. Voda enthusiastically took the gadget from Azil and looked around until she spotted an insect clinging to one of the tall swamp grasses. Look, Aze, there's a vargant. What are you waiting for? With the actinvorometer in one hand, Voda approached the tiny creature. One of the most common insects in the swamp, the vargant was easily recognized by its large eyes and two pairs of transparent wings. Just as she got near it, the bug darted to another blade of grass. You almost had it, Azil said, trying to encourage her friend. Almost. I just moved too fast and scared it, Azil watched again as Voda moved toward the vargant. This time she approached the insect much slower. With each soft step through the grass, bugs appeared to be moving toward her instead of away. One thing that always amazed Azil about her friend was Voda's natural ability to attract the attention and interest of both Fids, as well as bugs. The same insects that usually would flee from Azil were somehow drawn to Voda. I got it, Voda shouted. She looked at the actinvorometer pensively, then held it up to her ear. It's definitely in there, I can hear it. Voda let out a sigh of relief and smiled at Azil. I was worried it didn't survive. Right there, Azil said, enthusiastically pointing to several long-legged insects. See if you can catch one of those jumping bugs. Voda turned to see what she was pointing at. You mean a gropper? Yeah, I bet you can't catch one of those. One gropper? Voda smirked. Please, that's too easy. I bet I can catch all of them. With a determined look on her face, Voda crouched down and slowly moved in the direction of the bugs. As she watched Voda with her latest invention, Azil was filled with joy. The actinvorometer worked better than she imagined and appeared to be a natural extension of Voda's long, agile body. Like before, Voda would naturally be able to attract insects, but this time she was able to gently suck them up into the machine. Azil proudly watched as her friend found the vorometer to be both enjoyable and useful. She loved inventing just for the fun of it, but seeing others benefiting from the use of her creations filled her with pride and a sense of purpose. I can't believe how great this thing works, shouted Voda, waving the actinvorometer in the air. No more damaged bugs, and it's going to be much easier to get them home. Azil pointed to the lever on the side of the machine. I forgot to mention you can reverse the airflow to let them out. Voda cheerfully examined the small machine closely while rotating it in her hands. Out of all the gifts you've given me, I think I'm going to use this one the most. You're so inventive. I just don't understand why you don't share your genius with the rest of the village. Have you ever made anything for anyone other than me? Just my father, said Azil, shrugging. I feel like everyone else thinks I'm a freak. Why would I want to do anything nice for those fids? I don't know. Maybe they'd learn to appreciate your brilliant ideas like I have. You have no idea how much I love this crazy thing, said Voda, smiling and embracing the odd-looking gadget. Now I can fill my whole room up with bugs? Azil laughed. Your dad is going to love me when he sees his house full of insects. Oh, and Boden, he hates bugs, Voda said. Azil took this opportunity to divert the conversation to what had been on her mind all morning. About your strange brother, did you see how awkward he was acting around me yesterday? A subtle grin appeared on Voda's face. See, he does have a crush on you. Although Azil felt this was quite improbable, she still felt somewhat awkward and embarrassed by the suggestion. I don't think he's interested in me. It's pretty clear he likes Amble. Amble. No, I think he likes you, Voda said, grinning. And I think you like him too. Azil appeared to ignore the accusation and quickly changed the subject. What do you think he's up to in that workshop of his? Has he ever actually shown you any of his inventions? Because I know I've never seen any of them. Voda appeared to ponder this for a moment. Honestly, I've never cared to know what he's up to. We kind of have an unspoken agreement he stays out of my stuff and I stay out of his. That makes sense, Azil said. I really don't care too much about what my brother does either. But you've got to admit, Boden's reaction to the metal box was a bit strange. The serious look on Voda's face didn't appear to affirm Azil's observation. You clearly don't know Boden like I do. He reacts strangely to any question about anything. Azil had been wanting to tell Voda the truth about her brother. But how could she? That meant she'd have to admit to sneaking around Voda's house in the blindness and getting into areas that were private. Invasion of privacy was a big deal to the Fids. Aside from that, Azil had no idea how she could begin to explain all the strange things she had discovered. At this point, she felt she couldn't tell anyone anything about what she had found. She could handle any ridicule from the other Fids, but wasn't prepared to risk losing the one and only friend she had. To avoid suspicion, Azil had been sure not to leave any evidence from her previous night's excursion. She had put the strange disc back where she found it and resealed the door to the workshop. Unfortunately, she was never able to make much sense of all the strange things she had seen. The disc was still a mystery to her. The only thing she knew for certain is that it opened a small door on her back, a door which she had never known to exist. Her mind was racing with questions. Why the disc? And what was it allowing access to on my back? And what were those strange Fids doing in Boden's workshop? Were they his assistants? Were they guarding the disc and other strange secrets? She needed answers, but knew she couldn't discuss any of this with anyone, not even her best friend. But what about the weird Fid in the tree, she thought. Was it even a Fid at all? Azil knew it didn't look like anyone from the village. If it is a Fid, maybe it got sick of Lazov and left the village. Rubbing her chin, she pondered this idea. If someone left, that would mean the village is short of Fid. I wonder if Voda knows anything about a missing Fid. If she does, maybe I could tell her about the stranger after all. Azil caught up to Voda, who had gravitated toward a cluster of old Grust, a tall grass-like plant that grew along the edge of the open wetlands. Have you ever wondered how many Fids there really are? Azil asked. Voda paused for a moment and shrugged. What made you think of a strange question like that? 76, that's exactly how many Fids there really are. So we've been told, but have you ever counted everyone yourself? No, why would I do that? It's a known fact that we've been 76 strong for a while now, at least several generations. But if nobody has counted them, how do we know for sure? I'm sure my dad has counted everyone many times. Voda crossed her arms and looked directly at Azil. Why is this so important to you all of a sudden? It's not, I'm just curious. About whether or not my dad miscounted. Does it really matter? Azil got the feeling she had pushed Voda too much and made her feel uncomfortable. She slowly pulled back and acted like it was no big deal. You're right. I guess it doesn't really matter. There are as many as there are. For the first time since they met as noobs, many years before, there was an extended moment of awkward silence between them. Azil silently watched Voda for a while as she added several more bugs to her collection. Sneaking around, with the actin barometer firmly in her grip, Voda appeared to be completely absorbed in her quest. Azil decided this would probably be the best time for her to do some adventuring of her own. As much as she tried, she just couldn't stop thinking about the shady character she saw climbing the tree. Whatever answers she hoped to find, she wasn't going to get them standing along the edge of the wetlands. She'd need to go back to the swamp forest if she hoped to make any discoveries. Luckily, she knew a shortcut which didn't require her to have to hike all the way back through the village. From exploring with her father, She knew that if she followed the open wetlands, eventually she'd reach the far edge of the swamp forest. Visiting the area would give her the opportunity to search among the growth roots for a possible clue about the mysterious stranger. As she walked toward the swamp forest, she looked out across the vast open wetlands. The view had always been inspiring, filling her with a sense of possibility and wonder. Growing up, Azil imagined that there might be something out there beyond the water, perhaps more swampland to explore, or possibly something far more interesting. She often found herself daydreaming of another village of Fidzwan unlike her own. This other village would be a place that valued creativity and original ideas. It would be a place where she'd be appreciated for both her unique personality and her useful inventions. On several occasions, she mentioned to Voda the possibility there might be something beyond the water, but it was never discussed seriously. Voda would usually reply with a sarcastic dare that involved the high probability of Azil being attacked by Gazas. In the past, Voda's sense of certainty about their world never really bothered her, but now things were different. Now Azil was facing new certainties of her own, some which appeared to contradict what she herself had always been certain about. Continuing toward the swamp forest, she thought about her dilemma. How do you tell someone that they're wrong about something they've always known to be right? Voda knows that it's dangerous to go out in the blindness. She knows she's not indestructible. And she knows, without a doubt, that no Fid would ever go up a tree. And Azil knew if she tried to challenge what Voda believed to be true, it would certainly create more tension between them. Unfortunately, she didn't see any way around it. The things she was discovering couldn't be ignored, and eventually she'd have to tell Voda. When Azil reached the swamp forest, she thoroughly searched the roots of several holobial growths. Unfortunately, aside from a few useless rusty parts, she hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. Slowly, moving along the edge of the forest, she continued her search. Azil hopped from root to root, looking both up the trees and down near her feet. She carefully checked the cracks and crevices between the roots, hoping to notice something unusual. After a while, Azil realized she was now much closer to the village than the area by the wetlands where she left Voda. I hope she's not waiting for me, Azil thought. By this time, she wasn't too far from home and had no desire to trek all the way back to the wetlands. Looking ahead, she could already see the towering heap and the village off in the distance. But she noticed something more intriguing to her in that moment. There's the tree, the one from last night, Azil called out as she hopped off a root and ran up to it. She hadn't revisited the tree since the previous night when she witnessed a complete stranger doing the inconceivable. How did that shady black get up there? She wondered as she tilted her head back and curiously looked up into the tree. After investigating the trunk and branches, Azil carefully inspected the gaps between the roots. Nothing. Not a thing, she concluded, after a thorough search. Azil angrily jumped down from the roots, leaving a deep indentation in the damp ground. As she looked down at her feet, she noticed something strange. There were footprints everywhere, all around the base of the tree. Where in the swamp did those come from? She wondered. Putting her foot on top of one of the prints, it hit her. Oh, she thought, rolling her eyes. Must be mine from last night. This wasn't just another disappointment in a day, full of one letdown after another. Despite Azil's desire to head home to her workshop and forget all the strange things she had experienced, there was a part of her that just wouldn't give up without getting some answers. So she hopped back up onto the roots of the tree, where she last saw the stranger, and continued her search. This time she got down on her knees and reached her arm down into every crevice, feeling for anything out of the ordinary. Azil continued this process all the way around the base of the tree, but after a thorough investigation, she came to the realization that she had only succeeded in wasting more time. Nothing? Azil thought, shaking her head as she looked back at the tree. Feeling dejected, she sat down on a large root and closed her eyes. Almost immediately, Azil heard footsteps and reopened her eyes to see her friend approaching. I thought you had left me, Voda said. You look so immersed in your bug collecting. I didn't want to bother you. So I decided to go searching for metal parts. Don't you think this is a little close to the village to be searching for parts? Said Voda, motioning in the direction of the nearby roots. If there were any parts around here, someone would have taken them to the heap by now. Azil leaned against the tree and looked up into the canopy. Wonder if there's anything good up there. Why? Are you planning to climb up there and see? Maybe? That'll be the only way I'll know for sure. Probably not a good idea, Voda said, patting the tree. Holobial Nash isn't something you want to mess with. Oh, I almost forgot about that. Azil hadn't considered the possibility that she might become infected by the contagious and highly corrosive nash, which was believed to afflict any fid who dared to climb up any of the hullabaloo growths in the swamp. Plus, we're not exactly a climbing species, Voda said. How do you know? Asked Azil, looking up into the tree. Have you ever seen a fid try to climb a tree? Seriously, like that would ever happen. Voda said, rolling her eyes. It could. What are you saying? She glanced up into the tree, then looked at Azil. Are you thinking of being the first fid to climb a tree? Azil hadn't planned to tell Voda about the mysterious stranger, but felt this may be her best opportunity. I wouldn't be the first. Voda's eyes widened. You know someone who's gone up into a tree? Well, I don't exactly know who it was, but I saw someone do it last night. Last night? Said Voda, crossing her arms. On your way to my house, right? Not exactly. I kind of went out last night after everyone was idling. Voda stepped in front of Azil to speak to her more directly. Are you joking? Azil took a step back and threw her arms up. No, I'm not joking. You're honestly telling me your best friend that you did not idle last night? Of course I idled, said Azil, turning away and lowering her voice to a mumble. After I took a stroll in the nightglow. Azil shyly looked back, just in time to see an excited grin appear on her friend's face. What? Did you just say you went for a stroll in the nightglow? Though it was amazing. Wow, Voda said, shaking her head in disbelief. And all this time I thought I was the crazy one. Azil realized that the conversation had drifted away from her preferred focus. Yes, I went for a little walk last night, and it was amazing. But that's not really important. I saw someone climb up there. Azil pointed up into the tree, and whoever it was, they were carrying metal parts they got from the heap. Hold up, I'm still processing the first part. You walked around in the blindness. Yes, but I could see fine because of the nightglow. Azil shook her head. But that's not the point. She grabbed Voda's shoulders and looked her in the eyes. Focus. Why would someone have been taking metal parts up into this tree last night? Voda shrugged her shoulders. How should I know? Maybe someone was trying to build a trap to catch the Groken. Although Azil was amazed that Voda's answer made sense, she knew there had to be more to it. I think it was someone else, not one of us, Azil said. What do you mean? I thought you said it was a fid. It was, I think. I'm really not sure who it was because their body was covered with something. Whoever it was, I don't think they were from our village. Voda shook her head, then stared at Azil and narrowed her eyes. What are you talking about? There are no other fids. There are no other villages. We are it. Azil began to become agitated as well. She knew Voda's assured perspective was based on what she had heard and not what she had experienced. How do you know that? How do we really know anything other than what we've been told? I'm tired of listening to what others think they know. Don't you ever wonder if there's more to this world than what we've been led to believe? Of course, I wonder all the time, but I don't let it consume me. I've learned a lot about this world, mainly because I'm a curious fid. I've also learned a lot from my dad, just like you did from yours. But most of all, I've learned to trust that whatever I need to know, I'll learn or discover or figure out somehow. And I'm okay with that. What if one day you figured out the world? You thought you knew so well the world that caused you to hold back on what you wanted to do because of fears or doubts you had about it? What if you figured out that world was a lie and there never was anything to fear because the fears you had were not based on reality, the real truth? At first, Voda appeared stunned, but slowly smiled at Azil's passionate outburst. Where did that come from? Let's just say the past couple days have been rough, and they've created a lot more questions than answers. Azil gave her a half smile, then leaned against the tree and continued. For instance, who in the swamp is building something up in this tree? Looking at Voda, Azil ran her hand along the rough surface of the large growth. Suddenly, her hand hit something solid, something metal. She immediately looked to see what it was. Attached to the tree, there was a small steel peg, about the size of her thumb. Looking up the tree, she noticed another one and another. There were nearly a dozen of them. Vo, take a look at this, said Azil, pointing to the steel pegs. How did I not notice these before? Voda jumped up onto the root next to Azil and peeked around the tree. Oh, that must be how your mystery fig got up in the tree. Azil looked at Voda, grinning. And that's how I'm going to get up there. What? You've lost your mind? Vo, I need to go up there. I need some answers. Please just stay on the ground where I know you'll be safe. Azil's eyes widened as a new idea emerged. I've got a better idea. Why don't we go up there together? Voda stared at her with a blank expression. And get the nash? No, thank you. That other fid didn't look too concerned about the nash or the Groken. Well, maybe the blindness was affecting their judgment. Azil rolled her eyes. Let me tell you something about the blindness. It doesn't do anything except make it hard to see. Azil paused for a moment as a thought struck her. No, I'm wrong. It does do one more thing. It gives us another unnecessary reason to be afraid. Who's afraid? Everyone, Azil said, pointing to the houses across from them. Every single fid in that village is afraid. Voda shook her head. I'm not. You're not. Great, then let's climb this tree. I'm not afraid to climb up there. I just don't see the point. Azil could sense that Voda really wasn't afraid to climb the tree. Ever since they were noobs, Voda had always been the bold one. She never hesitated when it came to trying new things. But there were certain places like the swamp forest and beyond the edge of the wetlands she just wouldn't go. Suddenly, Azil realized that it wasn't the nash, the blindness, the groken, or anything else that Voda feared. It was the thought of disappointing her father that stopped her. With this realization, she decided not to push the issue. Maybe now isn't the best time to be climbing trees. Azil pointed to the unconventional in Voda's hand. I'm sure your bugs are getting anxious to see their new home. Voda nodded and held up the unconventional, now filled with insects. I can't wait till you see these things. After you left, I caught 2 more groppers and another vargant. Then I found some of those bugs you like. Bugs I like. Yeah, but I forget what they're called. Azil shrugged. What do they look like? You know, the tiny red bugs. Oh yeah, the bright red bozels with black spots on their backs. I do like those. Well, I have a bunch of them and dozens of other bugs. Voda eagerly climbed down from the root and started walking toward the village. Come on, let's go over to my house so we can let them out of this thing. I know you're excited to see all the bugs I caught with your new invention. Can't wait, said Azil with a smirk as she hopped down from the root and followed her friend. Chapter 10. Confrontation. After a brief introduction to Voda's new pets in the form of groppers, bozals, vargants and spiders, Azil left her friend's house to continue her quest to find answers. It had been less than a day since she had witnessed an unknown individual sneak through the village and then disappear up into one of the trees that bordered the dense swamp forest. What made the incident even more bizarre was the fact that the shadowy figure's arms were full of metal scraps. Knowing it might be the best place for her to find some clues to unravel the mystery, Azil returned to the massive heap outside the village. Since she knew the stranger had been lurking around the area, she hoped she might find something out of the ordinary, anything that could help to further her investigation. There's got to be something, Azil thought as she stood in front of the towering pile and quickly inspected its contents. Not recognizing anything unusual, she circled the perimeter of the heap, checking the ground for any obvious clues. It looks exactly the same as it did yesterday. With her arms crossed in disgust, Azil glared up at the mound. At that moment, light rain began to fall. Droplets of water quickly formed on the top of her head and trickled down into her eyes, obscuring her vision. Azil frantically shook her head, attempting to clear the water from her face. No, not rain. Not now, she grumbled to herself as she bitterly glanced up at the dim and murky sky. Unlike her friend Voda, who loved rain, Azil found it only made things more challenging, but not in a good way. From previous experience, she knew that rain disrupted both of her senses. If there was one thing Azil never wanted to feel, it was helplessness. She knew her search efforts would be hindered dramatically if both her hearing and vision were impaired. But possibly the worst thing in that moment was the fact that rain was causing all the metal, including her feet, to become extremely slippery. As the rain increased, so did the difficulty of Azil's search. Large drops of water bounced off her body as she tried desperately to continue her investigation. She found herself frequently shaking her head to eliminate the tiny pools of liquid, which continuously formed around her eyes. Azil had hoped to climb up to the top and begin a more thorough search of the heap, but Shi-89 realized that would have to wait until after the storm passed. This is not good, said Azil, putting a hand on her head. She cautiously walked around the bottom of the pile, but continuously slipped on every wet scrap of metal she stepped on. With every awkward step, she became more and more frustrated, not good at all. She realized she would have to postpone her investigation until a later time. Azil took a steel rod that protruded from the pile and used it for stability, as she carefully moved away from the slippery pieces of metal. In addition to the heavy rain, the intensity of the wind had increased. This is unusual, Azil thought. Although strong breezes were common for the swamp, strong and sustained gusts such as this were quite rare. Azil stepped away from the metal and tossed the steel rod back into the heap. As she turned to leave, she noticed 2 other fids walking in her direction. It was Boden and his daughter, Jersa, Azil could see that he had several large pieces of scrap metal clutched tightly in his arms. Boldly, she crossed her arms and yelled out to him, "Got anything good there?" Azil noticed he quickly reverted to that same awkwardness he had demonstrated on their previous encounter. "No, just some blark-a-lark," said Bowden, turning his body to one side. Azil realized that whatever he was carrying, he didn't want her to see it. Bowden slowly turned around and began to walk back toward the village. "Aren't you forgetting something?" she asked. Bowden stopped, but didn't turn around. "What?" he asked, speaking over his shoulder. "Weren't you going to toss out that blark-a-lark?" "No, I decided I might need it for something," he said unconvincingly. "Really?" Azil asked, glaring at him. "I doubt that." She couldn't understand the reason for Bowden's suspicious behavior. What is he hiding? She wondered as she moved closer. To her surprise, Bowden didn't walk away. Instead, he turned his head back in her direction. "What are you doing out here in the rain? Anyway," he asked, "shouldn't you be working on your next crazy gadget?" "Crazy? Is that what you think of my inventions?" Azil looked up at him and narrowed her eyes. "What's your problem? Ever since you became you've been a big pain." She looked down and saw Gersa's large round eyes staring up at her. Cautiously, Azil continued to tell Bowden how she felt. "You've been acting really strange lately, like you're hiding something." Still facing away from Azil, Bowden replied defensively, "I'm not hiding anything." She didn't believe him. "Look at yourself, you can't even face me. What is all that metal you're carrying? And I know you know something about the necklace." Before Azil had realized what she said, he dropped the metal onto the ground and furiously turned toward her. "That stupid necklace. You know how long it took me?" Azil jumped in front of Bowden and stared up at him, clenching her fists. "What about the necklace? Tell me what you know about the necklace." Bowden stepped back as he appeared to regain his composure. He then turned away from her and looked around nervously. "Where's Gersa?" Azil quickly glanced around and realized his daughter was nowhere in sight. If Bowden wanted help or sympathy, he wasn't going to get it from her. She wanted him to feel the sorrow and confusion she had been feeling. "Your daughter probably didn't want to stay around here and watch her father being a blark." Bowden appeared to ignore her as he looked around frantically for Gersa. Azil followed him and continued to let him know exactly what she thought. "You're off to a great start. You just got your noob and you've already lost her. I feel bad for Gersa having a blark for a dad." As he walked, Bowden shouted over his shoulder at Azil, "At least she has a dad." Azil lunged ahead, shoving him with all her strength. "You leave my father out of this." "Aren't you forgetting your father's not here anymore?" "Well, not exactly." Azil had been expecting Bowden to attack her weak spot, but his last 3 words had only confused her. She stood there in silence for a moment as she pondered what she had just heard. What does he mean? Well, not exactly. Is he saying my father is somehow partly here? Azil needed to know exactly what he meant. "What are you saying? Are you saying my father?" Bowden impatiently interrupted. "I don't have time for this. Can't you see I've got problems of my own?" He quickly walked away, leaving Azil alone in the rain with her thoughts. His stunning words had added to the ever-increasing mound of questions in her mind. Questions she doubted anyone could answer. "That's it, I'm done looking to others for answers," she thought. Deep down she knew if she was going to uncover the truth, she'd have to do it herself. Azil immediately realized what she must do. Determined to finally get some clear answers, she left the heap and plodded through the mud on her way to the swamp forest. Chapter 11. The Groken. Standing at the base of the grove where she had last seen the stranger, Azil peered up between its thick branches. Looking into the tree's dense canopy, she could barely see a thing. Even though it was still daytime, blindness permeated most of the space above her. "What am I doing?" she thought, stepping up onto the first steel peg. She realized of all the crazy things she'd done in her life, this was definitely the craziest. Climbing the pegs was easier than Azil thought, and before she knew it, she was within reach of the first branch. No turning back now, she thought as she thrust her body upward and grabbed it firmly with both hands. Now, dangling high above the swamp, Azil realized she had a problem. That was really stupid, she thought. I should have planned this better. She was now hanging under the thick branch, but needed to be on top of it. Instinctively, she swung her body back and forth until she was able to reach the branch with her feet. Azil immediately wrapped both legs around the branch. Next, she repeated the swinging technique, but this time she swung her body side to side. In one final maneuver, she forcefully tossed her body upward. Azil's eyes widened as she hung in the air for a moment. Then her body came crashing down on top of the branch. For a moment, she remained perfectly still. I cannot believe I actually did it, she thought. I am literally up in a tree, laying on top of the branch. She shifted her body and looked down over the side of the branch. In that moment, seeing how high up she was, Azil was struck by the reality of what she'd done. Okay, Azil, this is definitely the stupidest thing you've ever done. Slowly, she got to her feet and looked at the thick branch below her. Her eyes traced its meandering path, away from the trunk of the tree, into the dense swamp forest where it seemed to disappear into the shadows. Beyond that, she saw nothing. Is that the edge of our world, she thought? Does it really end there with that blindness? She had no idea what would happen if she continued farther along the branch. Despite her desperate need for answers, the way ahead, even if it was accessible, surely didn't look appealing. Instead, she decided to delay the inevitable and admire the view in the other direction, which was much more inspiring. Looking down, Azil could see what appeared to be her entire world, from the swamped forest all the way out to the open wetlands. She imagined the stranger may have used this spot to spy on the village down below. Down to her right, she could see the heap she had always known. Somehow, it appeared to be something completely unfamiliar to her. It didn't look nearly as impressive as it did up close. But it wasn't just the heap that looked odd. The world she knew seemed much smaller and simpler from this perspective. Observing the houses in the village, she imagined them as tiny mushrooms growing between the roots of the trees. She wondered what all the Fids were doing down there. She figured Voda was still busy playing with her tiny new friends. She thought of her mother and their relationship and the painful distance between them. Azil smiled pensively. Distance, she thought, wishing it was only the physical space between them. After a moment of contemplation and procrastination, she decided it was time to continue her quest. She turned toward the swamp forest and carefully walked along the wide branch toward the blindness. As the branch began to narrow, Azil's eyes gradually adjusted, revealing much more than she had previously seen. Just as it was in the night glow, the blindness in the forest was not absolute. She could now see that the branch she stood on wasn't the only one. Dozens of long and meandering great branches appeared to reach out in every direction. Branches of all sizes intersected and overlapped all through the forest, offering numerous pathways for her to choose from. At that point, she needed to find another path because the branch below had narrowed to the width of her body. Since the branches were wet, Azil was concerned about the possibility of slipping and falling all the way down into the swamp below. Maybe I should stick to the wider branches, she thought, carefully stepping down onto a larger intersecting branch. Cautiously, Azil began to navigate through the massive network of branches. She immediately found it challenging to stay focused on her mission. With nearly every step, she caught herself gazing around in wide-eyed amazement. This is unbelievable, she thought, looking up through the layers of branches above her. The forest was completely unlike any place she had ever been. As she made her way deeper into the maze of branches, Azil began to notice specific aspects of the forest that stood out. One of the most obvious was the countless number of vines. She had seen vines before, but nothing like this. All through the canopy of the forest, vines stretched from the treetops down to their roots. Stopping to admire the scenery, she was immediately jarred out of her serenity by a horrific yet familiar sound. The Groken, thought Azil, frantically glancing around. Again, a loud screech echoed through the forest. It sounded closer to her than ever before. It's not any closer you are, she reminded herself. What am I doing? Thought Azil, shaking her head. She knew it was one thing to no longer fear the Groken, but it was pure insanity to be intentionally moving in its direction. In her impulsive search to discover the stranger's identity and reason for taking metal parts up into the trees, Azil hadn't really thought about the potential consequences. She paused to consider her options. If I go back now, I may never find out what's really going on up here. Azil knew that if someone else was spending time up in the trees and hadn't been ripped apart by the Groken, maybe it wasn't as dangerous as she'd been told. Danger or no danger, I'm not going home until I get some answers. Azil straightened her back and marched forward as she boldly continued her quest. The strange sounds seemed to intensify as she moved deeper into the forest. Although she hadn't intended to, she realized she must be getting closer to its source. As it became louder, she noticed a more distinct quality to the sounds. What she heard was unlike any creature she had ever known. It let out bass-filled groans, followed by high-pitched screeches and eerie combinations of the two. Strangely, the noises sounded more mechanical than natural. Something about it reminded Azil of the myriad of sounds she'd heard in her workshop over the years, but this seemed to be more structured in some way. Although she had heard these sounds throughout her life, The experience of hearing them from this shorter distance filled her with a strange mixture of anxiety and wonder. In the past, she had heard many variations of the Groken. There were those rare days when it didn't make a sound and other moments when it was highly active. This was one of those times. As she continued up through the trees, Azil realized she could no longer see the swamp below her. The canopy with its vines, leaves and branches had become so dense that she had become disoriented and was unsure exactly where she was in relation to where she had started. I didn't realize our world was this big, she thought. In all her years of exploring the swamp, Azil had never been this far away from the village. Every Fid knew the dangers that awaited those who dared to go into the swamp forest, and this fear had kept all of them close to home. But now Azil was determined. She was not going to let this fear keep her from finding the answers she was looking for. Azil had now gone twice as far as ever before and was in awe of how big her world actually was. She stopped for a moment to listen to the mysterious sounds and noticed that most of it had now become drowned out by the sound of the wind, which had intensified. As she stood there, Azil was mesmerized by the sights and sounds. She found herself immersed within a dense green canopy of leaves and branches, which had come alive in the strong wind. All around her, the forest bounced back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm. This is amazing. Voda would love this, thought Azil, imagining the huge smile on her friend's face. Of all Fids, why hadn't Voda known about this? She always thought Voda had explored their world thoroughly. Surely she would have told me about this. Azil thought until she realized that no Fid, including Voda, would have discovered this. That's it. We've all been prisoners in our own swamp, trapped, not by actual dangers, but by the stories we've been telling ourselves. The horrific stories of the Groken had kept everyone out of the trees, just like the fear-filled stories that prevented everyone from experiencing the beautiful night glow she had previously witnessed. Where did all these stories come from anyway? She wondered. Most of the stories she had listened to growing up gave the impression there was only one safe place and time for a Fid to exist in the village during the day. Azil was starting to doubt if any of these tales were true. Could it all have been made up? She thought. Over the past day, she had defied what had been common knowledge within her society for generations. She had now traveled far from home and realized her world had not ended like she expected. Instead, it continued to expand with every step. As she proceeded deeper and deeper into the forest, the wind gradually subsided. This allowed Azil to hear the sounds of the Groken much more clearly. What once sounded like random, isolated shrieks and howls had combined and transformed, overlapping into rich layers of noise. She was now hearing details and frequencies in the sound she had never heard before. What kind of creature is this? Azil thought as she cautiously walked along another meandering great branch. As she hopped onto an adjacent branch, she peered around the enormous tree in front of her. Suddenly, she spotted something. Could it be? She thought. Azil curiously looked through the leaf-covered branches at the strange sight. Throughout her entire life, she had never gotten a clear idea of what had been making the unusual noises. Now she was staring directly at it, and it was massive. Is this the infamous Groken? Azil wondered. From a distance, she could see it had wrapped itself around one of the swamp grokes and had a few large appendages that spread outward, up the tree and along a couple of its branches. That thing is enormous, she thought. Azil knew she was still far enough away that it couldn't reach her. Inquisitively, she watched it for a moment to gain a better understanding of what she was dealing with. Even though it was still making noise, it didn't appear to be moving around. Azil moved closer to get a better look and noticed, although it hadn't changed position, it was shaking intensely. Because it hadn't come closer, she presumed it still hadn't seen her. Now, more curious than afraid, she cautiously continued to creep toward the massive creature. Its powerful sounds continued, generating a reverberation through the trees, which caused nearby branches and leaves to shake. Azil could feel this strong vibration through her body. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. She felt an unusual surge of excitement come over her, a feeling she couldn't explain. These sounds are so strange, she thought. She didn't know if the excitement she felt was from the anticipation of a threat or the recognition of something wonderful. Whatever it was, she knew there was no turning back at this point. Her curiosity and desire for answers had become much stronger than her fear of destruction. Could this really be the vicious Groken everyone had been talking about? Was this the creature that had been responsible for the disappearance of all those Fids who had wandered into the swamp forest? She understood the potential risk, but didn't care. She was more interested in knowing the truth about this mysterious beast. Instead of approaching it directly, Azil discreetly circled around while moving closer as she tried to get a better look. As she did this, more information was revealed. One thing was clear: the creature vibrated and shook with great intensity. But what is it reacting to? Azil wondered. There is nothing else around here. Azil held onto a small branch, which jutted up from the one she stood on, and observed the beast as it continued to produce its unusual sounds. It still hadn't appeared to notice her. Other than the shaking, its position had remained fixed the entire time. Since it didn't appear to be an immediate threat, she decided to move even closer. She slowly and quietly stepped toward the beast, but came to an immediate halt as it let out a horrifying screech. Azil remained frozen. Now they were both silent and motionless. Is it going to attack me? What is it doing? She wondered. She didn't know whether she should move closer or run away as fast as she could, so she remained perfectly still. For an extended period of time, there was silence. Azil remained motionless, waiting for the beast to move again. Then suddenly she jumped back, reacting to an intense sound, a different sound. I know that sound, she thought. It was the familiar sound of metal banging against metal. She immediately realized this was not the sound of a creature, but the familiar sound of a hammer hitting metal. This had never been the sound of something she needed to fear. As she focused her attention on the banging, it ceased abruptly. Now she was more curious than ever to know exactly what she was dealing with. Moving closer, she noticed more familiarity. This beast was actually made up of thousands of parts, the same kind of metal parts Azil had been making things with since she was a noob. Did somebody make this thing? I wonder if the mysterious stranger built this. Maybe this is what all those parts were for. Upon closer inspection, Azil recognized many parts that she was very familiar with, including dozens of clampets and kinucks. Amazed by what she was seeing, she ran her hand along the surface of the massive object. This is incredible. Could someone have actually made this thing? She wondered. Up close, Azil inspected the detailed construction of its awkward form. All of the metal parts interlocked to create a massive undulating surface, which seemed to flow up the tree and around several branches. It seemed completely illogical. Is this some kind of house? She imagined something or someone might live inside. That wouldn't make any sense, thought Azil, continuing her inspection. Nobody would live inside of something that makes loud noises and shakes. As she visually scanned the surface, she noticed something she hadn't seen from a distance. Livers, dozens of tiny livers. At that moment, Azil had an exciting realization. This must be some kind of gigantic machine. She was completely fascinated. In her entire life, she had never seen anything of this size and detail that had been created by a FID. Azil continued to run her hand along the machine in amazement. What in the swamp is this thing for? She wondered. Towering over her, the machine was almost as tall as the heap. But unlike the heap, this appeared to have some kind of function. Why would someone have gone through all the trouble making this? This must have taken years to build, Azil thought as she tried to make sense of it all. She was completely absorbed with curiosity and questions about the bizarre machine. Her focus was cut short by a strange and unfamiliar voice. She looked up to see someone standing on top of the machine, staring down at her. Once again, the individual spoke. At first, Azil didn't recognize any of the words that were being said, but quickly began to make sense of some of what she was hearing. These odd-sounding words were coming from a FID, but this stranger was unlike anyone she had ever seen. She was in the presence of a very unusual-looking male middy who appeared to be holding some kind of hammer. His body had an intense luster and was covered with other sparkling objects, which Azil imagined was some kind of elaborate jewelry that included shimmering dots of color embedded within the metal. Who are you and what is this thing? Asked Azil, pointing to the machine. I can tell you what this is, but trust me, you do not want to know about me. He casually leaned against the curving contour of the machine, which wrapped up and around the tree. Okay, Azil said, somewhat confused. The stranger gently thumped the machine's surface with his hammer. I call this my scalatron. So what does it do? Suddenly he jumped down from the machine and landed directly in front of Azil, causing the entire branch to shake. It makes music. What do you think? He said, throwing up his hands. Azil wanted to demonstrate to the stranger that she was intelligent, that she also made things, but this strange FID had just told her two words that were not part of her vocabulary. Music? What is music? The stranger looked even more confused than Azil. What is music? Seriously. How do you not know? He rubbed his chin for a moment. How do I define music? Music is sound, interesting sound. He appeared to be grasping for a more suitable definition. Music? Music is the most important sound in the world. It's a way to express what's deep inside of us. Azil honestly had no idea what he was talking about and wondered if it had something to do with that strange compartment on her back. What? What's deep inside of us? She asked. Although she wasn't trying to be funny, the stranger laughed uncontrollably. When he noticed Azil wasn't laughing too, he said, "Oh, you're serious." Feeling awkward, she changed the subject. "So who exactly are you?" Judging by his reaction, this seemed to be an equally challenging question. At first he looked away and scratched his head. Then he looked back at Azil. "Lucas. My name's Lucas." He immediately crossed his arms and looked away. "But that's all you need to know," he said, quickly glancing back at her. Azil was getting frustrated with his ambiguous responses and aloof demeanor. "How do you know what I need to know? I came up here looking for answers, and I'm not leaving until I get some." To her surprise, Lucas appeared to be completely unfazed by her outburst. "Let me guess, you've probably discovered some disturbing facts about your perfect world and came up here searching for answers. Right?" Azil was not used to anyone being so blunt. Although he looked similar to every other MIDI, he definitely didn't act like anyone she had ever met. Lucas's presence made her feel uncomfortable, but she wasn't going to let that stop her from getting what she needed. "Yes, I'm up here searching for answers." Lucas took a step back and looked at her. "Answers like big answers, or did you come up here because you wanted to know what kinds of birds live in these trees?" Azil stepped closer and looked him directly in the eye. "I'm here for the big answers." Lucas threw his arms up and took a step back. "Okay, I just want to warn you, most of what I have to tell you is going to shake up your world. Are you really prepared for that?" Staring directly into his eyes, Azil replied without hesitation. "Oh, I'm ready." Chapter 12. Water Beings. Lucas guided Azil deeper into the forest to his house in the trees. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. In many ways, it resembled the Skelatron, but this was much larger. It spiraled up and around one of the thickest halobial growths in the forest and appeared to be constructed from thousands and thousands of metal parts. Azil's mind raced with questions. How could one Fid have built this humongous thing? She thought as her eyes traced the contours of its unending surface. No matter how she tried to rationalize its creation, nothing made sense. "Did you build this?" Azil asked. "Yes, and I'm still building it." "I've been building it for..." Lucas paused for a moment, then continued to speak. "I've been building this place for a long time." Azil couldn't believe it. Here was a MIDI like herself who claimed to have built something that probably would have taken her a lifetime. From where she stood, she could tell it wasn't just thrown together, but seemed to be well constructed. She walked over to the side of the house where it connected to the large branch they stood on and looked up. The roof appeared to fold downward in a continuous curve, forming the wall next to her. It reminded her of something organic more like a body than any building she'd ever seen. Azil may have believed Lucas if he'd only claimed to have built that one section of the house. She stood back, evaluating the entirety of the structure. Dozens of curved surfaces connected to one another in a continuous undulating wave that weaved all throughout the giant tree. "There is no way he built this whole thing," Azil thought. "You did this all by yourself?" she asked. Lucas put his arms up and looked around. "Do you see anyone else up here? So you live all alone? But you must know about the village and the other Fids." "Fids? How cute. Is that what you're calling yourselves these days?" Lucas laughed, as if he had heard a joke she didn't understand. Azil clenched her fists. "What's so funny? Nothing. It's just, what's your problem? Why do you keep laughing? What is it you're not telling me?" Lucas stared at her wide-eyed and appeared to be trying to hold back another laugh. "Everything. I don't even know how to talk to you because you're so disconnected." "Disconnected? I'm not the one who's been living alone in a tree." "True. Maybe that wasn't the best choice of words. I guess I should just start from the beginning because nothing I say is going to make any sense without a little context." "Context? Yes. A little history. What do you know about the human race?" Lucas asked. Azil had no idea what that meant, but wanted to prove to him she knew just as much or more than he did. "Is it anything like the New Brigaloop, where everyone races around the swamp collecting Wanzolo pobs for the winner of Itzaglitz Day?" As his eyes widened once again, Azil quickly realized that her guess was not even close. Lucas slowly shook his head. "What you just said, no, the human race was nothing like that. I am talking about a society of people." "People, is that some kind of Fid?" asked Azil, tilting her head. "No and yes. Well, not quite. The people, the human beings, they were us. But you just said they weren't like us. How could they be us if they're not like us? I don't understand. This is difficult to explain. We were once a race, no, a society of organic beings known as humans, nothing like we are now. Our bodies were not metal, but instead made mostly of water." "Water? You mean like plants?" "No, not quite." Lucas tapped his feet and looked away. "I knew I was going to have to try to explain all this one day." He turned back toward her, slowly rubbing his chin, figured it wouldn't be easy. "Mim and I was right. Luckily, I had a little spare time, so I prepared something. Stay here. What was your name? My name's Azil. Don't go anywhere, Azil. I'll be right back. Lucas ran inside his house and returned a moment later carrying some kind of rectangular gadget. Here I made this video, said Lucas, handing it to Azil. Azil was immediately awestruck. The device astounded her with its unusual materials and intricate design. This is amazing. She looked up to see another confused reaction on his face. What's amazing? I haven't even started the video yet. This thing, it has that clear metal too. It reminds me of something I saw recently back in the village. For the first time since Azil met Lucas, he seemed to demonstrate a sincere interest towards something, she said. You saw something like this in your village, he said, pointing to the object. It wasn't quite the same. It was circular instead of rectangular and had some kind of clear metal similar to this, said Azil, tapping on the front of the gadget. You mean the glass? Glass? It's etched beautiful. This object you saw, was it a disc with words etched into it? Yes, how did you know? His eyes widened. Where did you find it? I've been looking for that thing for a long, long time. Azil wondered how he could possibly know about the disc. It was sealed in a room. Lucas put both of his hands on his head and turned away. Oh, I knew it. Turning back, he dropped his arms. It was all locked up. How? Azil didn't want to admit she had no idea what another one of his words meant, so she took an alternate approach. I had to get in the room using these. She removed the wire and nail from her bibit and showed them to Lucas. You picked the lock. Azil paused for a moment in confusion, but then realized what he was referring to. Of course, locks aren't that difficult to open, not difficult. I've been trying to do that for years. Can you show me how? Lucas reached for the items in her hand, but she pulled back. Why? So you can sneak around the village again? His jaw dropped. You saw me? How? I thought everyone in your village. Azil smiled and pointed at him. So, that was you. At first I wondered if you were an animal or something draped in those strange coverings. Lucas smiled. You mean clothes? Clothes? Is that some kind of plant or leaf? I guess you could make clothes from leaves, but that's not how I've been making them. Clothes can really be made out of pretty much anything. I've never seen anyone covered in clothes before you. What are they for? They can be used to convey a unique sense of style or for more practical purposes, like concealment, although that clearly doesn't always work. He then pointed to the device in Azil's hands. I'm assuming you've never seen or heard of video either, right? Azil shook her head. Lucas looked directly at her and spoke slowly. Azil, I'm about to start what is called a video and I don't want you to freak out. I know it's going to seem strange to you. Video is a kind of artificial moving representation of reality. This will show you how things were a long, long time ago. What you're about to see is not real, but it shows the story of your real history. He casually reached over and pressed something on the gadget. Azil watched intently as the video began. She was expecting something unusual, but when it started, her understanding of what was possible greatly expanded. Her eyes grew larger as images began to move inside the machine. Then she heard a familiar voice. Azil looked up, expecting Lucas's mouth to be moving. How are you doing that? Lucas laughed. What, my voice? I told you it was going to be strange. I recorded my voice a long time ago when I made this. Don't worry about that. Just keep watching. Her eyes grew larger as she continued watching moving images of strange, yet oddly familiar, non-metallic beings. It took her a moment, but she soon realized the voice was describing what was happening. If you are watching this, then you are just now discovering your true history for the first time. A long time ago, you were a member of what was called the human race. This was a society of organic beings who relied on the natural resources of their world for survival. Air and water were among the most significant as well as most plentiful, covering the surface of their world. Through acts of greed and ignorance, they had rendered these resources unusable. Without clean resources, the population rapidly decreased, and within 500 years, nearly every human was gone. The remaining survivors were forced to live underground, where they stayed for several generations. Many wanted to return to the surface, but discovered it was still incompatible with their fragile biological systems. They realized the only way they could inhabit the surface again was to create new bodies which would be capable of withstanding the toxic environment. This was the easy part because they had been creating these kinds of machines for centers. Their real breakthrough came with the discovery of what they referred to as LET, or life essence transfer. Before this time, their society was unaware of the eternal aspect of themselves which exists independent of their bodies. Life essence transfer allowed them to inhabit their machines to become their machines. Although highly controversial and experimental, a group of humans volunteered to undergo the transformation. During the development of their new bodies, there were those who were not entirely comfortable with the idea of living as a machine and what that meant. They feared it would cause them to lose important aspects of what it meant to be human. Up until then, humans had limited lifespans. During their lives, humans experienced a multitude of meaningful events: childhood, birthdays, first loves, weddings, careers, parenthood, and more. Even with their new metal bodies, they would still be able to experience these events, but they would become redundant and lose their significance upon repetition. And since their new bodies would offer them a practically unlimited lifespan, they needed a way to repeat these meaningful moments without the experiences eventually becoming stagnant, boring, and predictable. This was not easy. To do this, their bodies would have to be redesigned to integrate one final component: forgetfulness. To create the illusion of forgetting, they realized they would have to simulate the human lifespan as it was, which would need to include the experience of a beginning and the illusion of an end. Then through this process, they would re-emerge into the world with new bodies, new identities, new families, new adventures, and new discoveries. The volunteers would be able to experience all the joys of being human, but with the advanced capabilities of a machine. The process of development took decades, but eventually the volunteers were sent back to the surface in their new metal bodies. During the initial phase of their mission, they were to rebuild and create an entirely new society. As the video ended, Lucas reached around her to push a button on the machine. Now do you understand? Those volunteers were us. Azil shook her head in disbelief. That's impossible. I would have known about this. Someone would have told me. My father, he would have told me about this. She pushed the device into his chest and started to walk away. Your father didn't tell you because he didn't know. It has been a long, long time. Everyone in your society has experienced the cycle of life so many times. Azil turned back to Lucas. What about you? How are you able to remember all this? Lucas paused for a moment and looked to be searching for the right words. There's something you need to know about me. There's a reason I'm living up here in the trees instead of down there in your wacky village. Unlike you and everyone else, I was never blessed with the ability to forget. When we started this all those many years ago, each of us agreed on a role to play in the creation of a new society. I could have been an architect, a scientist, a teacher, anything. So what did I do? Stupid me, I chose to be the historian. Historian? What does that mean? Asked Azil, narrowing her eyes. It means I had to be the one responsible for ensuring everyone knew where we came from and what our purpose was. I had to record and document everything our society ever did while still keeping up the illusion that allows everyone else to live normal lives. If you know so much, then why are you up here keeping all this information to yourself? Lucas smiled. Very good question, Azil. Why don't you ask your brilliant leader, Lazov? He's the reason I'm up here in the first place. Azil suddenly realized there must be some truth to all of this, because nobody else outside of Lazov's family knew his true name. What did Lazov do? Somehow, he found out the truth about me, that I am basically immortal. Azil held up her hands. Hold on, what does that mean? Immortal means that I do not have a life cycle like everyone else. Instead, my life goes on forever, it never ends. What? Your life never ends, said Azil, shaking her head. I shouldn't say never, because apparently our bodies can be hacked, and that's what Lazov did. Hacked? She said, tilting her head to one side. What do you mean? I mean, he discovered a way to bypass his own mortality. Azil's eyes widened. I never knew that was possible. Oh, but that's not all. What else did he do? You know, Lucas said, grinning. Think about it. Suddenly, it all started to make sense, Azil. Wait, let me guess. Lazov got rid of you because you knew the truth. Then he created his own ideal society, Zovia. Lucas jumped back and pointed at her. Exactly. So did this happen recently? Again, Lucas laughed. No, not quite. This was thousands of years ago, thousands of years. What have you been doing all this time? Lucas pointed to his house. A little bit of everything. But the main thing I did for the longest time was my job, although not so much anymore. I observed and documented the unfolding of Lazov's grand vision, his own insane little utopia, and it just became too painful to witness after a while. Azil didn't understand. Why was it painful? Lucas raised his voice. Do you not see what's going on down in that village of yours? Do you not see what's wrong with that place? With your society? I guess everyone's a little clueless. A little. You have no idea how clueless they are because you don't remember how they were. Originally, they were nothing like that. And the hardest part about all of this has been seeing that fool slowly take an amazing and passionate group of individuals and turn them into a hopeless and ridiculous bunch of fids. Lucas turned away from Azil and put his hands on his head as he continued to speak. If you knew all that I knew, if you knew the totality of what Lazov has caused everyone to unknowingly sacrifice with his lies. And for what? So he can have everyone running around, acting like idiots afraid of their own shadows. This was not how we intended to rebuild and reestablish with the fate of humanity in the hands of a selfish and deranged narcissist. Having heard Lucas's words, Azil was practically speechless. So everything, it's all made up. The blindness, norphoonication, all lies, he said, nodding. Azil had a sudden realization. What about my father? What do you mean? Where did my father go when he was supposedly norphoonicated? Where everyone goes, except for Lazov and I, back to the beginning. You mean he's a noob? Yeah, I'm afraid so. Her body went limp as she realized what this really meant. Noobly, she said softly. What? Azil shook her head. Nothing. I guess he's forgotten everything, including me. Yes, that's what you all do every time. You forget. Lucas looked away. Wish I could. She thought for a moment as she tried to put all of this information into perspective. Why are you telling me all of this? Am I the first one you've told this to? Lucas nodded. I have wanted to tell someone about this for the longest time, and I've tried. Believe me, this is not the kind of thing you can tell anyone, and I can't believe you are still here listening to me after what I've told you. Your society has been buried so deep under all of Lazov's lies and stories. All the bizarre tales Azil had heard throughout her lifetime filled her thoughts. One in particular stood out. Like the vicious Groken? Is that what he's calling me these days? Azil nodded awkwardly. Really? It always changes. First it was the dreaded Karkazark, then the pernicious Mongersnip. See how he uses fear to keep everyone from discovering the truth. Well, not anymore, shouted Azil, standing up straight and tall. Once I get back down there, everyone's going to know the truth. Lucas put his hands up. Not so fast. It's not going to be that easy. You can't just tell an entire society their whole understanding of reality is a lie. So how do I do it? Try starting small. Start by telling the one individual you can trust the most. Azil couldn't imagine how she'd break the news to Voda. How could she tell her best friend that her very own father is the real monster? Just be careful, Lucas said. As soon as Lazov becomes aware that you know the truth, he'll find ways to discredit your story or make everyone think you're crazy. On the surface, he appears fun, but he has a nasty side, and I've experienced it many times. Azil nodded. I know I'm not exactly his favorite fit. Give me a few days. I will come up with a plan, but I need to get going now before the blindness. It's actually called darkness, and it's not going to harm you. I know it's not dangerous, but I can't see through it too well. It may take a few days, but I'll think of a way to spread the truth. You may not want to worry about that now. There's something else you should know about. A storm is coming and it's big. I know. I got caught in it today. There was a lot of wind. That was nothing. What you experienced, what we are experiencing now, it's only the beginning. It is going to bring tremendous amounts of rain, wind and flooding. Everyone down there in the swamp is in serious danger. Wow. I had no idea, said Azil, staring at him wide-eyed. Thanks for the warning and telling me the truth about everything. She was about to leave, but Lucas caught her attention. Wait, before you go, can you tell me the truth about one thing? At first, she couldn't imagine anything she knew that he didn't, and then she smiled as she remembered. Let me guess, you want to know how to pick locks.